You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Travel back in time with me to an era when dead stars had a chokehold on clubs around the world and every goth owned a modified gas mask. A kid walks down a long fluorescent corridor in the mall, avoiding the stares and comments of passers-by. In their mind, they are a toreador, a preternatural creature of the night unbothered by the trivial and trite concerns of the sheep that surround them. A Poptigma Berserk blares from headphones connected by a long black cable, terminating in their black Jensen portable CD player, sitting comfortably in the spacious black pockets of a pair of garish trip pants. Thank Kane for anti-skip technology. If this sounds at all familiar, I hope you remembered to take your Tylenol this morning on account of all your back pain. It sure wasn't easy walking uphill both ways to school in a pair of 6-inch demonias. It's quite clear that the last several years have seen a surge of 90s nostalgia, both in and out of subcultural spaces. More recently, much of that pining for a land lost to time has shifted to the early 2000s, a hauntology impinging on the capitalist hellscape in which we currently reside. That rosy retrospection has engendered a yearning for ephemera such as those iconic Genco and Trip pants that had a habit of collecting rain and mud around the bottom, the tracksuits and all-denim outfits I was wearing in middle school, and the iMac G3, along with its cohort of transparent technology. Curiosity about and recollections of that era of goth have been tickling the brains of subculturalists as well. We are here today to scratch that itch. We're going to really dig into the sights, sounds, and smells of the early 2000s. We'll be talking about the club scene, the ways Columbine shaped the future of goth post-90s, elitism, gothic literature, and why smiling was against the rules. As always, I'm your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Joining us on this episode are the ineffably perspicacious Jesse Meowser, Lindsay, and Bruce Lord. So let's start at the beginning, shall we? While we are here to discuss the early 2000s, the now iconic 90s era of goth had a large influence on the direction we took in the Noughties. I wasn't part of the scene in the 90s, so anything I've ever said about them has been conjecture or hearsay. But I'd like to ask each of you to share what you were doing in the 90s, how you entered into the goth community, and if you have an opinion on what ways the 90s lingered on through that liminal transition into the bright future of the year 2000.
Yeah, thank you. The 90s, like you said, it was its own iconic era, and the times were very different then. And I haven't really gotten much of a taste of that throughout the decades. Not that there haven't been great things or whatever, but it was a very distinct time. Some of it was like, for myself being in a metropolis and basically in California all the time in the 90s and the 2000s primarily, it was before a lot of gentrification happened. So it was a metropolis, pre-gentrification, happening in downtown areas and art districts and queer neighborhoods. And it was a very different vibe. Not that none of that happens now, but things are different. I feel like it was more underground. And I feel like the 90s were also much more defined in what is goth. It redefined. It was like, let's take this and make it more goth.
Mm-hmm.
And for myself personally, for entering the scene through the coffee houses, before the clubs, before the shows, in downtown San Diego, we had a couple of really amazing, a few really, but my two favorites, there was one called Old Vienna, and it was literally in downtown San Diego, the Gaslamp Quarter. And it was like a Parisian cavern, sort of stone archway kind of thing, meandering back, full of San Diego's freaks, basically.
Nice.
And we would all mingle there. And there were kind of goth sections and kind of punk sections, but kind of not at the same time. And then this other one that we really loved was called Gas House. And that one was also in the gas lamp. And it was a really cool spot. And then it just blossomed from there into the nightclubs and the record stores and so many shows and things like that. Mm-hmm. And then we were home to fashion icons in some sense, where people who were on the pages of propaganda and inside the pages of propaganda, the people that were performing were within our local communities, whether it were San Diego or Los Angeles or San Francisco.
Yeah, that's very cool. Lindsay, what about you?
Yeah, I might differ a bit from Jesse and Bruce on this part, because while I was into goth music on and off while I was in high school in the 90s, it was actually only the early to mid 2000s that I started to really become involved in my local dark community. What came to mind when I was thinking this over is that, like, unlike a lot of my friends who were involved in the 90s, I felt like sometimes I've been behind on some of the subculture knowledge or kind of rites of passage that similar age friends who were involved in goth since their teens had. But I think the overwhelming feeling I've had since becoming involved in my local scene is one of welcome and mostly non-judgment. And that's been really lovely. People in the scene were usually more inclined to happily talk and educate any of the music or culture gaps that I had, rather than gatekeep or make me feel bad for not knowing something that's usually considered probably quintessentially goth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just for context for this episode, I grew up for most of my life in Victoria, which is kind of a smaller town on an island near Vancouver. So that's where what I'll mostly be talking about. But actually, when Jesse mentioned hanging out in coffee shops, we used to have a goth coffee night every Friday, which I can talk about more later in the episode. But that was a really great way that underaged members of the community could be involved. And that was actually a really big part of our scene. And that's something that, comes to mind in like the early to mid 2000s. I was really curious if other communities had similar things. So I already have an answer for that.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to bring that up as well at some point. Probably when we talk about the club scene next. But Bruce, what about you?
Yeah, like Lindsay, I grew up a distance away from the metropolis of Vancouver. Unlike her, I lived on the mainland, but in a suburb about an hour's drive east of it. So kind of the usual experience of, I think, being near a city that offered culture, that offered escape, that offered finding the sorts of records that you were beginning to realize were out there and that you absolutely needed to get, but it's still being a little bit out of reach. And then, as you start being able to drive or whatever it is, very much like the internet emerging at the same time, those things start to become a little bit more accessible. So it really was a case of kind of baby steps out of beginning to, on my part at least, recognize that there was this real distinct thread, this real distinct world, this real distinct sound within the general milieu of what to me was sort of just 90s alternative stuff. The older I get, and I'm sure I'm painting with too broad of a brush here, but the older I get, I do think that there was something specific about the experience of spending your teen years between the years when the wall came down and then 9/11, like just bookending that period of kind of general, the Fukuyama end of history, it's all going to be okay sort of vibe, that did end up trickling into the idea of just sort of, you can kind of make of yourself what you want. And there's all of these scenes, there are all of these sounds, there are all of these identities and whatnot. So making my way through that, and then eventually beginning to be able to start going to clubs in Vancouver, and like a lot of people, that being just an absolute life-changing click moment, like, you've talked about it many times, Danny, of like walking into this room and seeing all of these people and just kind of going, oh, right, this is it. This is this thing that I've sort of have had a half-formed vision of in my head for all of these years, and now here it is, and now you get to be part of it. Like Lindsay, I did think that there was maybe a bit more openness, conversation, willingness to sort of, take baby bats under your wing or whatever it might be at that time. That was also accompanied with a little bit of gatekeeping, but I do not have as much of a problem with that as some people do. This is maybe just the sort of, again, as I get older, the like, well, we all drank from the hose and we turned out okay. We all got gatekept and we turned out fine. We don't. I don't know, but that's a big subject. But anyway, that's a rambling little introduction to my experience.
No, I appreciate that, and it's certainly relatable. So, well, maybe we should talk about the club scene first, then, and the music scene in general, and then kind of work our way into more sociocultural subjects. With the club scene, I guess the question to start off would be, in the early noughties, in the early 2000s, what was being played, I guess, and then what did goths think about what was being played in terms of complaints, requests, that kind of thing?
We're really blessed here in California with the club scene. In the 90s, definitely there were a lot more just goth nights, dark wave, goth, death rock, post-punk kind of thing. But then it started to evolve a little more. But a lot of it, like you hear the dancing alone. But back then, I feel like the dancing was much more flowery, much more creative, more peacocking in the 90s, I would say. But the clubs were a dream. The venues, the people. I mean, like I was saying, we had the actual propaganda models and performers in the clubs with us. We had the models with us, and it's California. So between Hollywood alone and San Francisco and just all over the place, so much creative energy here, so many creative, talented people that would just bring it with their looks. It was, kids today talk about the pressure of having the right outfit. I mean, you click and you're suitable. Wear black, you're suitable. Don't stress. Back then, that was my inspiration in my face all the time, which, it also spawns more creativity. And some things that also from now to then that I feel is when young people talk about, or newcomers talk about, the gatekeeping that happens now versus then, I'm going to agree with Bruce that, some elements, it's just to protect the community. It's to protect this, just get to know you better and see where you're at in this dark room.
Yeah.
In LA in particular, I would say definitely more distinctly than anywhere else I've ever experienced in California or otherwise for the scene. LA can not allow somebody in quite easily. They will just, no. You can try to give them money. No, you're not going to get in. If you go home, you try a little to actually engage in this night with us rather than gawk at us, then please come on in, come back. And that still happens sometimes. But for the most part, it's been really welcoming, and it's just always a good time. There's too many options sometimes, especially back then and right now. You just can't make it to everywhere.
Do you remember at all what kind of music they were playing? Or is it just kind of a blur?
Oh, yeah. Back then, some of the iconic songs would be Wolfsheim, Sparrow and the Nightingale.
Oh, yeah.
And that one kind of died out in the 2000s. And quite frankly, that song for a moment did get played out for me because you kind of couldn't go anywhere without hearing it.
I have the single on vinyl right next to me, actually, weirdly.
Yeah, I don't know why, but it was extra sweet if the German version came on.
Mm. Yeah.
We definitely had a lot of German spoken songs back then.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
Deform was
Mhm.
another one that I especially enjoyed. And I think a couple of the go-to songs for the playlist that would definitely get people to the dance floor would include Rain of Blood and also The
Mhm.
Age. There was a lot of the classics still happening, and there were people from the 80s still there. And I love that stuff. Definitely new wave in general. The new romantic stuff in particular was happening. And then towards the end, I started to notice what now I would I came to identify as EBM and industrial genres, which nowadays some of it I think would fall under dark wave. But it was a lot of what was coming out of Metropolis Records by the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Definitely it was a heyday for Cleopatra Records,
Mm.
but still definitely, 4AD, Beggar's Banquet were labels that definitely mattered. Wax Tracks. One that was another on the flip side of the industrial cousins, if you will, that did these things with us. Soylent Green,
Mm.
War,
Yes.
Mhm.
iconic. And I see they're a little controversial now, but I don't understand why. I don't pay attention to everything on the internet. But End One, Deutsche Maschine,
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
then get to all the future pop type stuff like VNV Nation and Apoptygma Berserk.
Mhm.
It was good times. I mean, and so much was happening right here in California too, like, Cinema Strange, and they have a sort of show coming up,
Yeah.
I think, with Diva Destruction. Switchblade Symphony was coming out of California then, The Shroud.
Mm.
Just so
Yep.
I'm sure I'm missing missing so much. It was a good time. It was just being in rooms of hundreds, even more than 1,000 people.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fantastic. Lindsay, what about you? What was your experience?
Firstly, I definitely relate to a lot of what Jesse just said. A lot of the
Mhm.
band's genres, absolutely. We were listening to that too. And I think, yeah, just living in a small, I guess I would say Victoria's a smaller city. So the scene was really quite small at that time. So it really depended on the DJ. Like some had tried and true playlists that didn't vary all that much, but we would love what would be played, so we would be very happy with that. Some songs that after a while felt like they almost had to be played so that we could have our group kind of high energy dance experience. When I remember, which is probably again pretty familiar with a lot of scenes, is This Corrosion. So that was
Mhm.
the typical like DJ bathroom or smoke break song that
Yep.
everyone would still love, and we dance for 10 minutes straight, loving it. But yeah, so that was a big one. And I can remember two of our DJs used to play a lot of death and goth rock, and we're actually in a death rock band. And one DJ who I actually ended up marrying used to play industrial and EBM. So those were a lot of also the main genres that I was being exposed to at the time.
Mhm.
But to bring Bruce into the conversation, one of the very exciting things that I remembered from that time was traveling from Victoria to Vancouver for Sanctuary Club Night. So I'd take a bus, a ferry,
Mhm.
another bus or two, and get to downtown Vancouver and dance until about 2 a.m. and then stay awake in a coffee shop until I could get the first bus and ferry back to the island. And it was
Yeah.
amazing. Like I was just so happy the entire time. And one of the biggest points was how Bruce and Alex, even then, were playing songs and bands that I'd never heard before. And I felt like they were really proactive with often trying to find new music. So it was a really different experience of hearing, brand new music a lot of the time when I visited that night, that I either instantly loved or grew on me as I kind of researched the band more and tried to track down more tracks from them.
Mhm.
So that was really influential. And I know I share that with a lot of the The name we named ourselves was the Gothvic community because yeah. So a lot of Gothvic, I think, also had that experience of going to Sanctuary and just loving it. And one thing I think, again, like I mentioned with the Goth coffee nights, it was really important for us to have all ages nights because of the high proportion of underage members of Gothvic. So to keep everyone involved, sometimes we'd rent out. When I say we, I actually wasn't involved in the planning, but the community would rent out cafes, sometimes even our cultural centers where alcohol wasn't sold, but everyone could still dance and enjoy. Mm-hmm. And some of my best memories are of that night, just because we were all dancing together and everyone was involved. Yeah. And one other point when I think about music was, I guess, again, because of the lack of live shows coming to the island, we'd get really excited when a lot of us could go to Vancouver or a band came to Victoria. And I remember actually going to see Sisters of Mercy for the first time, and me and the Gothic group were just so excited. And I remember talking to some other people after the show who were like, "Yeah, it was okay," but we were just so high on the energy of seeing Sisters that we didn't care. We were just having the best time. Yeah. So yeah.
Oh, just to circle back on a couple of points there, I'm glad that Lindsay has all of those fond memories of coming out and seeing us. Would that have been at the Purple Onion, Lindsay? At the first club viewing?
I don't think so. I actually forget. I think it was Club 23.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we were in 23 at that point. Okay, yeah. I'm just glad you were making that trip out when we actually got it off of Sunday nights and was not closing at midnight, because spending that much time just to, it's like you've got from 9 to midnight to get all of your DJing and all of your drinking in. So just, go bug. And then, you have to be up at God knows when for work in the morning.
Oh,
yeah. To call back to the aforementioned Alex Kennedy, my DJ and podcast partner, who was fond of saying, Goth Industrial is a DJ format. It is not an identity or a club night. Or excuse me, it is not an identity or a subculture. It is just a club format.
Yeah.
And if I've talked about this so many times with friends from all around the world. If you don't grow up, in a hotbed of things like Jessie did in LA, where, as she's saying, to this day, and speaking with friends in LA, they're like, oh yeah, there's the 2 industrial nights, the 1 death rock night, and the 2 dark wave nights happening tonight. Which do you want to go to? Mm-hmm. If you don't live in that sort of a city, then I think the whole idea of like goth industrial emerges kind of out of necessity in the mid to late 90s as one. A collective, collation of all of these sounds, new and old, that, if you know, and you're going to enjoy at least 60% of it. It's certainly a reflection of what the Cleopatra roster and then shifting over to the Metro roster were like at that time. So while I very much agree with all of your, your historians and sociologists and, musicologists who sort of point out, look, these are streams that have very different, distinct histories going back, and there's nothing, the original Batcave has nothing to do with like Sheffield Industrial, and like, yes, I agree with all of that, but by the time 1995 or 1996 rolls around, all of those people are kind of blending together, whether out of necessity or out of creative impulse. In terms of specific music, Jessie is bang on in reminding people of just how big and important Deform were in the 90s. I don't think that really is understood, that just like Deform owned a certain chunk of 90s dance floors. Kind of feel like at least their legacy in North America has kind of been overlooked. And the fact that they weren't, that at the last minute they got scrapped from that 1 year at Cold Waves is kind of a bummer. Certainly, pre QAnon Ant One was definitely a thing. That's the deal there. It's the time when a lot of those darkwave bands, so many of whom were American, that Jessie was talking about, still were holding sway. But of course, we're having to then butt heads with or vie for club time with kind of the emerging, conflict within industrial of both, future pop and power noise happening at the same time. And to the point, Lindsay's point about different DJs. Yeah, there was, in Vancouver, kind of before I started DJing there was like, okay, our like, swirly goth, dark wave DJ. And depending on when her set was versus the other guy who was, just in all in on, Hands and Aunt Zen and everything that was just going to be blasting your eardrums out with power noise for 45 minutes. There was a real
Yep.
sort of difference there. So, I think there's pros and cons to be sort of talking about the individual histories and identities of all of those different sounds. And again, for me, it would be sure there is some. I feel like people sort of overstate or presume to overstate the amount of kind of second wave English goth rock that was actually being played at that time. That some was being played, but it was a pittance compared to how much dark wave was happening in a lot of the clubs, just because that more electronic sound was more what I think North American audiences wanted to hear in terms of getting them dancing. So certainly, first wave classic stuff was in there. But yeah, so as much as each of those genres that I'm referring to there, dark wave, future pop, and power noise, and then if you want to throw general EDM in there as well, all of those things have their own history. But, for that period from, 1996, kind of until the present day, depending on what city you live in, they're bound together. It brings to mind, for me, Donna Haraway's distinction between identity politics versus affinity politics. Identity politics referring to a sort of, okay, well, this is a particular lineage, this is a particular history, this is a thing that is you, and you are it, and you are locked into that.
Right.
Versus this sort of, more rhizomatic understanding of, well, we're all here and we all have a shared interest, and therefore we don't have to make a permanent identity out of whatever this temporary arrangement or temporary linking of interests or aesthetics is, but that does, at least in the present, bind us together. And that idea of affinity is something that I think really cements, how it is that all of these different genres somehow came together. I love kind of playing the game of just, if you played if you played Sparrows and the Nightingales, and if you played a PAL track, and then you played a Vendemian track or something for your parents, and sort of tried to explain to them, no, these things would all be played at the same club night. What is it that they have in common? Well, the people who are listening to them and the people who are enjoying them were all together in the same rooms at the same time for a period.
Yeah. Yeah, I very much had that exact goth industrial as a scene experience that you were talking about. Because I was getting into goth in the early 2000s, and I knew goth music was the Sisters and the Mission and Fields of the Nephilim. But I also thought synth pop and future pop and industrial were goth, because at the time, most events, DJs were playing mostly synth pop or aggro tech. And so as a new goth, I didn't run into a lot of people that were talking about Bauhaus or Rosetta Stone or whatever. I didn't, and then because I didn't have a lot of access to buy music, I usually ended up downloading torrents with these big compilations on LimeWire, or listening to internet radio on Winamp or something like that. And the torrents and the radio stations were, labeling themselves as goth music, but it was a lot of industrial and future pop and synth pop. And so that, in my mind at the time, was part of the same community, the same thing. They were both goth. And I think people relied a lot more on DJs and compilations and things at the time, because we didn't have Spotify or whatever. The first iPod came out in 2001, and people were still carrying around these 200 disc CD cases everywhere, or using even Walkmans or something like that. And the iPod came out. That was a huge, that was a big deal to me when it came out, but it was also $400, so I couldn't buy it. And so I think we relied a lot more on whatever the scene was playing was what we were listening to. So from some of the popular songs that I can remember, actually, Bruce, when you guys were talking to Covenant and mentioned the Stalker Club mix, that was definitely one, along with Call the Ships to Port, obviously, that kind of thing. I heard Skinny Puppies Assimilate a lot. Suicide Commando was pretty big. The Bind, Torture, Kill song I heard a million times. Floor Killer or Dead Enough for Life by Icon of Coil. Obviously, military fashion show from the I don't remember, some mid 2000s, I think, when that came out. You never heard the end of that. Seabound, Assemblage 23, lots of VNV Nation, basically anything VNV Nation did. Lots of Metropolis, Jesse, like you said. Neurotic Fish, The Bomb, I remember that getting a lot of play. And towards the end, second half of the 2000s, Combi Christ was everywhere. Everybody Hates You. Basically everything off of that album got played, and then lots of some Neurotic Fish too. Lots of aggro tech like Fosgore, X Fusion.
Oh wow!
But there would be stuff like Quintal would get thrown in there, or whatever. Rod or Sand was. Yeah, and to your point, Lindsay, I did feel there were a lot more all ages opportunities to hang out at. There was a goth coffee shop I could go to, or kind of like goth, hangout coffee shop. When I started DJing in 2007, a lot of the shows, basically all the shows I DJ'd were all ages as well. And I guess even from that perspective, the bands that were playing on those bills were for these goth nights, were like Cruise Shadows, Ego Likeness, Icentilla, Esper Machine. I remember playing a few shows for them. Aria, however you say that. There were some goth bands that, like Bella Morte, the Spiritual Bat, I remember them playing. But it was really that blend of there wasn't that many proper goth bands that were getting played. And I don't know if that had anything to do with the sort of trope of the 90s where everybody was complaining because everyone sounded like a Sisters of Mercy clone, and people just got sick of it and ended up leaning into industrial more. I don't know, but yeah, that was my experience as well.
Yeah, this is all really interesting to me because this is kind of a blank area in my goth history. I got into goth in the mid 90s, right coming out of high school, going into college, and most of my early experience was in central small town, college town, Illinois. We had just one club, and like Bruce mentioned, that led to the idea of this goth industrial amalgam, because it was just the one event, one night a week, and it was goth industrial. There wasn't a heavy distinction between the two. I had a fair understanding to some degree of what the distinction was, and that it wasn't all a goth thing. But I enjoyed both, so I didn't really care at the time whether something was goth or industrial or what its actually lineage was, other than if I really like something, it's easier to find it if I kind of know something about its lineage, or I can research other things of the same type, looking back in time. But yeah, definitely that having that limited scene, everyone needed to be supported to some degree. So it was just, a little dive bar, gay bar in the town that had one night, which had our main DJ that would come in, and he'd play his mostly industrial because that was his preference, but then would throw the bone to the goths and play your greatest hits, your Sisters and Bauhaus and Susie and whatnot. So, but that was in the 90s. And then I stayed in that scene, a couple other nights and stuff until probably about 2002. And then was when I started moving around, got married, moved around some more. Really wasn't involved in any club scene in anything other than very tangentially with goth until probably, I had a couple of little glimpses in 2007. I did Convergence up in Portland, and also nice. Bat Stay in LA. But other than that, I didn't really start getting back until probably closer to 2010 when we moved to Colorado Springs and settled there for a while. I started getting into that local scene. And that's where I started hearing just how much it changed in that nearly a decade away from being the sort of old school Wumps Cut and By God 20 and Frontline Assembly that was being played in the late 90s over to the 2000s when I left the scene, to hearing, the bands that you've been mentioning with your Covenant, VNV, Velvet Acid Christ, little bit of Deform, but it was odd. You guys were talking about how Deform was sort of a mainstay, and I never really was in a scene that I would consider that true. Though Reign of Blood did have a lot of play in that Colorado Springs scene, but that was the only Deform song that ever got played there. I played the hell out of Cantique because that was my favorite from the '90s. And a couple others because I think, one of their greatest hits, and then maybe a couple other albums of theirs because I was a big Deform fan once I discovered them. But nobody else was really playing them at the time. So it's really fascinating to hear that they were, I guess, had some notoriety or at least were well represented. I don't know if it was just where I was or if it was more in that Gap era that I wasn't really involved that was being played. But it was just really interesting to hear how the music changed from sort of the more experimental industrial is how I usually think of it to the more dancey, club friendly EBM lineage into future pop and then power noise and agrotech. That was also one of my major complaints getting back into the scene too, is I found a lot of the stuff which the swirly goth stuff, or the at least a little bit more broken beat, less four on the floor kind of experimental industrial stuff that I was really enjoying when I started in my journey into the whole dark alternative scene, was supplanted by what I considered pretty tedious and boring four on the floor dance music, because I didn't find that interesting to dance to. So it was an interesting sea change, and it's interesting to see how, as time has gone on from there, we've sort of found a happy medium as things have gone into the present.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say, as far as Deform goes, amongst people that I knew, that was never a baby bat band.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've noticed, though, recently on TikTok is young people catching on, which is interesting. And I think that comes back to just the access of music is so different these days.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like back in the 90s, when we were going to get new music, it was an adventure. Like we had to go to a certain neighborhood, for myself, oftentimes including a shuttle and literally walking 4 miles, like 2 miles, and going to that specialty record shop and either putting something on custom order, or because it was a specialty shop, it actually did have something like Deform, but it was going to cost like $25. And this is the $95.
Yeah.
So it was,
it was interesting how much luck I had at local Tower record listening stations and Borders. So I found like Faith in the Muse and some of those other bands, which was really fascinating to me because most of my early records buying was a little independent record store in the college town down in central Illinois. And they had actually a pretty good selection there too. So I did find a lot of good stuff there. But yeah, I got a lot of luck. I tended to haunt those Borders and Tower records listening stations a ton, and would usually find one or two little things after listening to all of the options on offer.
Just to maybe build off of something that Trey was saying about the forces that pushed him away a little bit, or that kind of left him a little bit cold. I went through a similar period, and I would, if I was to levy the blame at anybody or whatever, it would be the really, not even like the first wave of what gets tagged with the future pop name, but just the real diminishing returns and the echoes of that. Your real poor imitators of those bands, and then absolutely once agrotech gets established as just something that a certain, and look, I'm whatever, not to judge, but like I did definitely see like kind of a wave of people, younger people coming in who I think had kind of heard about I don't even know how, but had gotten into agrotech maybe laterally through metal somehow or whatever, and were just like, oh yeah, it's heavy, but it's dance stuff. There's a club where they play that and everything. And when that was really, when there was just such demand for that, and when we were talking before about, first Clio, then Metro, and then when kind of the existing ecosystem of, Euroscene labels really all went in on that, all went in on agrotech for a number of years. It just became such slim pickings as a DJ, to rely on any of those kind of existing streams or those existing labels that you'd had relationships with or whatever for a while to be giving you anything new whatsoever. So it was a real sort of like, I have these memories of just spending weekends just flipping through like track, skip, like no, and then just hoping that there's one track on this new, on the Septic 9 compilation or whatever, that you might actually be interested in playing. And it really did drive me to either get a lot more creative in terms of digging up old stuff or finding material that was not being made by literal goth or industrial bands, but that had enough within its own musical DNA that people wouldn't know the difference if it was being played mixed in with that sort of stuff. You don't know what the band looks like or whatever when you're just hearing this track, and so if the beats sound good, it gives you a little bit of something there. So yeah, I had that same sort of tune out period from a lot of the existing right down the pipe business that was happening there, prompted me to go off and research all manner of completely non-scene related material, which was good for me probably as well. But yeah, that burnout was definitely real. And it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe 2009 or 2010 that I started finding things that were picking up a little bit more traction that did make me feel a lot more, creatively, or just whether that's, for listening at home or as a DJ that got me excited.
Yeah, remember Alien Vampires?
Oh God. yeah. There you go. Perfect example. The fact that band has like a major label deal and everything, and people actually request it. And hey, people requested it. It's not just the label.
Sorry, go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, no worries. Just really resonating a lot with what you all are saying. Like, Trey, you are not alone as far as having this moment in 2000s being, what is this? And I think as far as younger people getting introduced to some of that industrial side of things that started to dominate, basically, like, it was more than a change from what I could see, even in LA, where industrial started to dominate the goth scene instead of the goths dominating the goth scene.
Mm-hmm.
And LA, of course, did have options, though. You could go to a strictly industrial only club and you could still go to a goth or a goth dark wave thing or what have you. But I think it was 2002 or 2003. I worked at Hot Topic for a minute, and I lived for the Metropolis record compilations that they made. And that was where for less than $10, I think even under $7 maybe, you could get around, I don't know, several, maybe 10 songs. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
But they were pretty legit songs for the most part. You would definitely get some good stuff on there. And at that time, I think starting in the late 90s, I started noticing that Metropolis Records was a funnel for the European music labels to enter the United States. And they were definitely out there promoting their artists from what I could see. So I think that also added to it. They were really pushing them.
Yeah. I think my first, I don't know if it was my first, but the one I remember the most as a compilation that I got from Hot Topic was not Metropolis. It was the Asleep by Dawn DJ Ferret or Dancing Ferret Records compilation. I think that was mid 2000s. But anyway, so let's talk about, before we get into more of the cultural values of goth at the time and how that differs, I thought it would be good to provide some broader context, because obviously societal technologies, politics, history, media are always changing and have an impact on the ways that we gather and the art we make, the way we express ourselves, even if we think that it doesn't. So goth obviously wasn't this discrete entity. It was influenced by that kind of thing. So I wanted to ask a little about that. Maybe we can start by talking about how you were treated by outsiders or normies, as I called them at the time, as a goth, and go from there.
Well, I think people were still intimidated by the appearance of somebody who was really decked out. But I think also, too, that for back then, looks that would be considered very casual now would have been on the extreme side back then. It was a stark contrast to what others were doing. But there were some commonalities, even just in aesthetics, like around 2000, 2001, I think in particular, there was a maxi skirt moment that everybody was doing it, except for the men or masculine presenting. That was something that I noticed very different from the 90s. In the 90s, I saw a lot of biological men or masculine presenting people in dresses it was normal all the time. And it didn't matter if you were gay or straight or not. You were goth and you were doing a maxi skirt today again. And in the 2000s, I feel like it became much more casual in general. And I think that's something that aligns with mainstream fashion becoming generally more casual through the decades.
Yeah, I remember the more casual look in the 2000s.
Yeah, at that moment, really, it's like, come on, guys. Okay, maybe on Monday or Sunday, but it's Friday. It's Saturday.
It's Friday. I'm in love. Let's go.
Pretty much. I'm in love. At that time, I was also the 90s and the early 2000s. I was 24/7 goth. I had a earl piercing right between my eyes, dropped down lower, and you got noticed. But again, being in a city, like I think it was Bruce saying about the escape. No one's really gonna, at least in my experience, really stop you and do something. But certainly, that's among locals. But if you're on Hollywood Boulevard on the Walk of Fame and it's 10 p.m., 11 p.m., somebody's going to say something. Somebody's going to say something insulting or teasing at best. And they feel quite all right doing that.
Yeah, I think a lot of how people reacted to me and friends at that time was related to external culture, which I think we'll touch on later. But in my experience, the reactions seem to me to be a bit more negative than they are now. And that perception might also be a function of how old I am now versus then. But yeah, I specifically remember parents and relatives being concerned about me being involved in something dangerous, which I'm sure some people can relate to. And Danny, I know you've talked about growing up in a religious background as well, but my mom would, and I grew up in the Pentecostal church. And so my mom would regularly get angry about how I dressed and being, just seemed concerned I was involved in cults or something satanic. And I would get negative comments sometimes on my appearance from others, and at school, for example. I don't think I received the abuse for it that many others did. And I remember feeling vaguely relieved at some point in the last 10 or 15 years that the comments and prejudices didn't seem to be getting thrown around as much anymore. Again, this is just a personal experience, but like I remember I had a friend at the time who wore nail polish and makeup, and he recounted being beat up a few times in Montreal for looking different. So lots of different experiences for sure in that way. But I feel that the overarching feeling I have now about perceptions toward the subculture seem to be more positive, if anything.
Yeah.
Like there's more curiosity from people rather than blanket judgment. And of course, some fetishizing, which has always been present. But kind of strikes me as more pervasive now, if anything, and probably also influenced by social media. Like you see a lot of viral videos on TikTok and stuff. So yeah, that's kind of my perception about it then versus now in my own experience.
Lindsay, you're reminding me back in the 90s, I guess like my teachable baby bat moment I got was about the lunch boxes and the metal coffin boxes and all that.
Oh, nice.
Huge. But this is also a way for you to defend yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
You know, something about the scene, and I think of how it factioned off of the whole punk side of one of the factors was, and you know, a lot of us goths really don't have all these violent tendencies towards other people. Like, we're not very aggro.
Mm-hmm.
So at the same time, though, the 90s overall were much more aggressive than now.
Yeah.
And it made sense for the pretty boy in the skirt and high heels to have a metal box.
Yeah.
Or the girl looked like a lady of the night.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, as much as, you know, I kind of roll my eyes whenever the latest version of, you know, goth goes mainstream or celebrity so-and-so wears a goth inspired outfit, and we have to have a whole bunch of hand wringing about that. If nothing else, I feel like that has prompted, as I think you both sort of referred to, kind of a sense of either awareness or interest, or at least kind of mild disinterest, which is the exact opposite of what it was like growing up in the mid 90s in a small town, in a very biker heavy town. If you had a somewhat, you know, effeminate presenting look, you know, I had for a while there, I had a fairly kind of, you know, classic romantic goth, you know, puffy poet shirt, the tight vinyl pants and all of that sort of thing going on. And that just meant that, you know, you were getting the business. You know, you were getting shit thrown at you from passing trucks. You know, you were going to be dealing with it every day of your life at high school and whatnot. Thankfully, you know, in terms of family stuff, that was all relatively easy for me. I think my parents could sort of see a link or a connection between all of that and the existing, you know, literary and artistic and kind of general cultural interests that I'd always had. So there wasn't too much of that sort of concern. They were just concerned that you're just going to get the shit beaten out of you, or you know, you're going to get into a fight and get stabbed, you know, or something like that for walking with your friends downtown late at night or whatever. So yeah, that ends up producing, you know, a certain kind of you know, us against them, me versus the world sort of siege mentality, which on the one hand, there is something exciting about that when you're, if, you know, in my case, if you're, if you're a man and you're kind of already kind of high on your own, you know, sense of self in those teenage years, you know, and there's only certain forms of violence that you're maybe most worried about. But that is also something that I think you have to kind of learn to grow out of later on. And as Lindsay has sort of said, the ambient pressure just ceases to be as intense, and sort of coming around to an awareness of that was something that I really kind of felt happening to me in, I don't know, maybe 2004, something like that. Just this sort of like, oh, I'm not, you know, having to sort of like steel myself for God knows what. You know, I live in the big city now. I can just put my headphones on and get on the bus, and it's shit's going to be chill, you know, which it certainly wasn't for a lengthy period of my life there. There are a whole bunch of factors, I think, contributing to that, some of which, Danny, I know you had on the format sheet, so I don't know if we want to get into those already, that both in terms of real world events, but also I think changing cultural attitudes that are really palpable when you look at kind of the range of time that we sort of have on the table here today.
I think we'll probably talk about real world events next. And I think that's also a good point about the sort of divisiveness, them versus us mentality and identity formation. I think I wanted to talk about that as well. I won't say, to your point, Lindsay, I'm not going to say anything about the religious stuff so much from my perspective, other than to mention that in my house, the satanic panic was still panicking. So I had that to deal with. But yeah, I was on the end of a lot more hostility when I was younger than I am now. In school, people were always asking me, like, in a pejorative way, not in a curious way, things like, are you a boy or girl? I get called Marilyn Manson or Neo, or the F slur. People would ask if I was gay, ask me if I did drugs, if I was a Satanist, that kind of thing. I don't get any of that now. The only thing I experience now is sometimes when I pick my son up from school, the Gen Alpha kids will call me an emo or something, which is laughable, really, compared to what I had to deal with before. And I don't know if I feel like holistically America was more conservative 20 years ago without, like if you heard about a trans person, it was because they were on Jerry Springer and being misgendered and that kind of thing. There's a lot more homophobia, which I think was driving the sort of, animosity towards effeminate looking people. Actually, when I was in high school, there was something called a metrosexual, which was literally just a
right.
neologism for men who had personal hygiene skills, basically. And yeah, to another point that I think a couple of you made, you wouldn't ever really see somebody with tattoos or weird piercings or colored hair working at any store other than maybe like a tattoo shop. And if you did, when I did run into them, it was like this rare experience and everybody was kind of looking at them and commenting on them. Whereas now, when I go to Target to get groceries, I'll see like there was a kid who looked like he was straight out of the 70s punk rock scene. I'll see like there's a goth dad there. Basically everyone under 40 has dyed hair or tattoos.
Some over 62.
People with huge gauged ears. None of that stuff happened when I was younger. So I think that's definitely a big shift.
I actually have a story about that.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you completely. And that was actually a big topic of conversation with the Goth Vic crew. In that was a big pet peeve. It was really hard to find jobs with colored hair, piercings, and tattoos. And I had all three and started a job at a hotel. And the front desk manager actually told me, okay, like I loved my blue hair. So it was my new blue hair. I still have it years and years later. But he told me, okay, we can't have you continue working here, even if you're working in the back, just in case you have to go to the front desk and a guest sees you, it's not appropriate. Mm-hmm. So instead of dyeing my hair a natural color, I actually went out and bought the most hideous wig I could find that was a natural color and just put it on and didn't say anything. Did not say anything. And everyone was incredibly confused. And I continued working there for a year with this just bizarre wig. Yeah. So one of my fondest memories that I was able to get away with that.
Sorry, just to pin off of that, one of the other things with fashion that was so much of a part of the 90s, you alluded there, Danny, to like, trans folks being made fun of on Jerry Springer or whatever. Before that, we had the whole wave in the 90s of like the Goth or Freak makeover episode, of Ricky Lake or whatever it was. And those were, if you'd want to talk about a weird catalyst for like coming into contact with something, again, growing up in the suburbs, okay, here's this person who has this incredible hair and this awesome look and everything like that. And sure, fine, it's a work, it's pro wrestling, it's not legit. We know that now, but at the time when you're 15 and you're just like trying to piece together like, oh geez, maybe if I paint my boots this way, or I've got this record at the thrift shop, I wonder if it's good. When you are trying to sort of piece together this sense of identity, seeing somebody who has this like awesome, incredible, confrontational fuck you look on television, and then just kind of going through this barrage of just like, his girlfriend wants him to cut his mohawk off, or his her parents want her to wash all of this silly cobweb makeup off or whatever. And it's this whole sort of just like, no, hold to it, and then seeing the after photos, just like Lindsay is sort of saying, look at how boring, look at how, not just boring, but just look at how ridiculous this person looks like, basically in drag as
Yeah.
somebody that they are not.
Yeah.
That was that is such a defining moment for me, and I have memories of those particular episodes of daytime television.
Well, that's a really
Yeah.
good, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, that whole era of talk shows became shocking. That was the goal, shocking all shows. And my pre-goth years in the early 90s, it was the club kids, the New York kids, and
yeah.
What that was, but that was very interesting to me. And it became the shocking talk show was basically the new sideshow of that time. And for all kinds of reasons, like everybody said, you weren't going to be tatted, pierced, and bleached and spiked and all that and count on having a good paying job. And that's why I don't have my Earl anymore. I ended up getting a corporate job in a conservative community. So it's so much more acceptable nowadays to look alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a really interesting, or at least I thought it was an interesting thought I had about a month or so ago, I think in preparation to one of our previous episodes, was this idea of, how we're always accused as goths of, it's not Halloween where you dressed up in a costume and all that stuff. And what I think the reality is a difference between, I guess, the sort of the societal normal idea of proper attire versus goth is that goths are the ones that are refusing to put on the appropriate costume. As you talk about, appropriate attire for a job or for certain events, you're expected to look a certain way. You're expected to dress up a certain way, where a lot of goths will wear the outfit that they resonate with regardless of situation. They'll go out shopping, they'll go out clubbing, they'll go out to pick up the kids at school wearing the same outfit because that's what they are more comfortable with. So there is an idea that we're not the ones putting on the costume. We're getting abused because we're the ones refusing to put on the costume.
Yeah.
All your thoughts are interesting, Trey. Don't put yourself down. No, and Bruce, I think that was a good point you made too, because I think the mid 90s, early 2000s was probably the last time that goth was as prominent in pop culture as it is now. Because I was thinking about this, you had obviously, everybody knows it's the Crow soundtrack, all those Tim Burton movies. The Undertaker for some people was important. Spawn was important for some people. You had like Ruby Gloom.
The Craft.
There were The Craft. There were goths in the Deftones music video. Blair Witch 2. Queen of the Damned. I wrote all these down. Sammy and Danny Phantom. Goth Talk on SNL. Richmond on the IT Crowd. All of that stuff. And so that was a lot of people, I think, came into contact with goth through those weird outlets. Maybe I can ask you guys then, what ways you think external culture influenced the inner workings of goth? The general cultural structure, the way we treated each other, the way we thought about the world.
A lot of people, when they enter the scene at any era, but especially that safe haven aspect of things, of, okay, in mainstream culture, even if I don't dress the part, I don't have the preferential, normal goal look or attitude or whatever it is that makes you feel othered in mainstream, generally conservative society in comparison today, even with the conservatism that we have today. Back then, within the confines of the goth community, you were not only accepted, you could just be. If you wanted to celebrate it and wave your freak flag, certainly you could, but you could also just be. And back then, if a lot of people worry about, I'm going to go to my first goth club, and I get that. I felt that for sure. But, you don't have to be the best at makeup or the best at dancing or the best at styling. You can sit in a corner and just take it in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
And
think kids now feel the same amount of pressure as we did then to look like up to snuff, basically. So that's a good point, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, so back then, I think though, in some ways, for me in the 90s, I feel like when it was dominated by goths in the goth subculture, that in some ways it was just a darker new wave, like dark wave, right? But really just
Mhm.
of the new romantic era, just darkened, and the truly gothic being so prevalent of just being immersed, as you say, Danny, things like being in that castle.
Mm-hmm.
In the LA scene, for instance, alone, there's a lot of creatives that are actually making the movies that you're referencing, or they're making the costumes, or they're on set saying, no, a goth actually wouldn't do that, or, some sort of technical input like that. But at the end of the day, even though these advisors, cultural advisors, if you will, are there, or people within the community that's just their job and they are there.
Yeah.
Sometimes the production is still going to just do what the production's going to do. So, bringing up like good old Columbine, for instance, or like Neo in the Matrix, different fabrication, but the trench coat being an iconic sort of thing in the 90s, early 2000s, as a representation of the negative perception that gets developed by the media based on something that's not even real. I mean, there's a shred of element, right? It's not like the goths never worn a trench coat, but it was in the Columbine incident. It was not a goth wearing a trench coat. It was somebody else wearing a trench coat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Jesse covered a few things that I was going to mention. And just, again, trying to remember, lately I've been thinking a lot about memory, and I'm wondering, how much of this is me wearing rose-colored glasses looking back at the time. But the prevalent feeling that I have was that, how can I put this? Probably that the community felt a lot more aware of, discriminations that external, people outside the scene might have had. And I felt like we were trying to actively fight them, for example, like sexism, fat phobia, like were mentioned in the show notes, both within and outside of the goth scene. And the feeling I have very strongly is that there was a greater sense that we have something in common with each other. So let's try to support each other and pay less attention to any perceived differences. So it really was a kind of feeling of us against them sometimes, not necessarily in an aggressive way, but in a we band together kind of way. And focus on our shared interest and lifestyle.
Yeah, when this was on the list, one thing that really occurred to me was one of the major transitions that I think changes that has happened in this period that we're talking about are, and I want to be clear here, speaking as a straight guy, speaking, from a Canadian perspective here, that at least the public facing attitudes with regards to queer identity and whatnot have changed, at least on the surface for the better. Like, which is not to diminish or say that these things are not forces or present, or that they are not fights that are still currently ongoing and everything like that. Disclaimer. But the just the kind of overt, blunt homophobia that you would encounter, not just in like high schools or in a lunchroom or something, but just from the government or from very public figures, just bluntly using these slurs or saying, why would I hire that person, or whatever it might be. That changed. And I think for me, that was recognizing that sense, again, to use that word I was using a while ago, recognizing that affinity was something that was really important to me. Realizing, okay, I'm going to get, beat up or attacked or whatever it is, or have shit thrown at me, regardless of who I sleep with. So actually, that doesn't really matter in terms of where my own beliefs or whatever lie, which is why I was always very hesitant to when, Danny, you were talking about the sorts of questions that you would get, in high school about, are you gay or not? Are you a boy or a girl or whatever? For me, sort of trying to sort of say, well, actually, I'm a straight guy, did not ever really seem, that doesn't square the circle.
Right.
That doesn't resolve the problem, and sort of having that moment of just sort of realizing, right, I experienced this, all manner of people experience this. It's not okay. For me, at least, that was such a major part of what I enjoyed about the scene, was this idea that, like, no, like, queer acceptance and fighting for, gay rights, whether that's governmentally or socially or whatever it might be, that was so much an important part of kind of my awareness of the late 90s growing up. And so I think, like, that being something that I saw within Goth as I found out more about it and everything was, as Jesse was saying, like, this is a place where you can just be, and that's fine. Obviously, there are all sorts of reasons how and why, goth clubs have often, or goth club nights have often ended up in traditional gay clubs over the years. That's a very, very long reaching history there. So seeing that change over from kind of within this weird space of goth, through the 90s and into the early aughts. I remember I was DJing the day that, like, Canada legalized gay marriage or whatever. And again, not, assimilation, blah, 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 not the only fight to be fought, etc. But observing those sorts of changes happening from within there, I do sort of think that did very much influence how I viewed those larger societal changes that are obviously so much bigger than just, a bunch of weird kids in black running around in nightclubs.
Mm-hmm.
The other point that has sort of been circled around a little bit here, when you were talking, Danny, about the iPod, or, when Jesse was talking about the difficulties that we all faced in shelling out for, for buying import records, is, of course, a change in the sense of either accessibility of culture or I know you and Trey have talked about this ad nauseum, but the hypothetical end of monoculture, right? To the point that when we have a monocultural phenomenon like Taylor Swift happening right now, it's quite surprising. So I feel as though that sort of had to, the fact that there was no longer just one single center, there was no one single representative of mainstream culture when you kind of come out on the other side of the 2000s, I think that forces you to sort of reevaluate the very, again, combative, reactive, us versus them sort of attitude that, again, I'm talking about myself here as much as anybody. When you sort of realize, wait, it's not about me versus someone else. It's me in the midst of a bunch of other people who have their own shit and are into their own things. And maybe I get along with some of them and maybe I don't, or whatever that happens to be. That prompts a reorientation, I think, away from just this simple binary mainstream versus underground type sort of attitude. And there's all sorts of, negative fallout from that we can talk about, that has happened there. But I do think that reorganization of how mainstream culture even exists is something that I think has, maybe, I wouldn't want to speak for them, but has probably changed the way in which younger people getting into this sort of stuff view themselves, view their own identity, view their relations, or what sort of how testy or how combative their relationship is or is not with the outside world. And I want to be a little bit optimistic and hopeful about that, and hope that produces, people who don't sort of then think, oh, well, I was a goth, I was a freak, I was an outsider, so therefore I can't have a problem with race, or I can't be behaving in a bad way in this way. I hope that is something that has changed there. And if that means that, hey, we have to live with the fact that all of the music that we fought so hard to find and identify is now just as equally accessible as any other music, hey, that's a trade-off I'll take, I guess.
That's kind of where my brain went thinking about this, because there were a lot of positives mentioned, and I was thinking of the negatives. And feel free to tell me that I'm wrong on this, but there were two primary issues that I came up with. The first one was that's because sexism was more of a standard in broader culture. I think there was more sexism normalized in goth culture then than there is now. I mean, we probably all know about that Dunja Brill book that came out in 2008 that was about sexism in goth and industrial, and talking about how like there was more of an expectation for women to be bi by default, whereas men who were bi got more subcultural capital from that because they were being brave or transgressive, in this kind of power imbalance, that kind of thing. And then the other part of that I thought of was fat phobia in the scene, which, you know, obviously you had in general culture, you had women openly being mocked for their weight. There was, you know, coming off the heels of the heroin chic thing, you had media, like companies calling women who were just normal, average weight, plus size. And so I feel like, at least in my experience, there was more fat phobic ideology that seeped into goth in the way that we treated people, kind of valorizing the ultra thin Peter Murphy physique, and women who weren't super thin being treated differently. I know, like I don't remember what documentary it was, but Voltaire said something at the time about it was supposed to be a joke, something about how, like, when you see a skinny goth guy, he'll always have a fat goth girlfriend walking next to him or something like that. And so I feel like that was more of a thing as well. But
yeah, I'd love to jump in on that. And I am plus size. I've been normal size and variations of plus size throughout. And in the 90s, I was normal or very voluptuous. And still, definitely, male gaze was about me. But within the goth community in the 90s, definitely in the early 2000s, I mean, skeletal thin was mainstream and underground. In the mainstream, it was about 90s heroin chic, high fashion, haute couture, and the top labels, Kate Moss, and the whole concept of the waif of the 90s. Even in crowd surfing, you would go to something where there was a mosh pit with intensity that I don't see very often anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the girls that were waifs were allowed to crowd surf, and that was it. Certainly other people were.
Yeah.
But the rule of the venue was waifs only. And that era, you know, like you said, like Peter Murphy, David Bowie, all these propaganda models, rail thin was in, but it was also, again, the safe haven side too. But the mainstream, I think rail thin didn't necessarily mean the same things. But within goth, you know, also in the early 2000s and the 90s, sizes weren't so readily available as now. And certainly there were custom pieces getting done, and the makers of really amazing brands were right there, or maybe even your friend. But, you know, there's a cost to that too that could be a roadblock. But again, just black was fine. True style's free.
But it's a good point about the safe haven versus societal pressure to kind of bend to whatever the perceived ideal was. And I think, of course, everyone was affected by that, and we still are. But I do think, yeah, things are progressively getting better. At least I hope.
Yeah, two more points. Lindsay, you know, and all of you really, but myself, I know I'm a cis het woman throughout this. I've always presented that way. And as far as sexism goes, then I feel like amongst the people that I was friends with and myself in the scene back then, being scantily clad was never for the male gaze. Being
Mhm.
clad was just a certain goth aesthetic, or actually kind of a feminine statement of I can be allowed to dress this way. Men are topless in public all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it was a different time.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into that too with the fashion and sort of the crossover with BDSM and kink communities and that kind of thing. But I guess before we get to that, let me add this thing that's come up a few times. One of the major external influences on goth was both Columbine and then maybe a little more indirectly 9/11. And so I wanted to ask about what were your experiences, pre and post Columbine, pre and post 9/11. How do you think that changed things?
Well, Columbine definitely, I think, was one of the things that pretty much just touched everyone in the community, because you hadn't felt some sort of in-person real life something, you were probably going to encounter that. And I know for myself that I did worry about people thinking I was a bad person, even though I know I'm a good person and people that really know me know I'm a good person. I worried about what people thought, definitely. As far as 9/11 went, I mean, that was definitely a day I can't forget. I was in California. I was woken up by my dad, told to turn on the TV. And I don't know what time it was anymore. It was morning for me over here, I think. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like watching a movie. I really couldn't believe what I was seeing. At first, I thought it was just a plane crash. And just seeing those people, those poor people falling down those buildings,
Yeah.
covered in ash, and just the ongoing anguish. And then there was this strange moment of, on one hand, we are all American. We are all together in this. With like xenophobia increasing in other elements at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then for myself, I happen to live very close, like walking close down the street from at least one of the terrorists that went into some pilot training thing. I could be, I want to say out of Florida, but was involved in all of that. And then I think at the time I worked in radio news. So for me, my perspective of that is also takes me back to being in the newsroom and talking to the reporters there, and talking to people whose loved ones died on the plane, and some of those firsthand accounts. I really don't remember it having an impact on me within a goth context, except maybe, when things like that happen, or like the massacre that happens in these different gay clubs, like Florida, for instance, the not so distant past,
Right.
moment for me being in these metropolitan areas, in these, whether it's a queer venue or not, I'm just in a metropolitan area, Target. And then you put me literally inside that venue in a box, Target. So as far as a goth context, it's just, it puts a certain more acute vulnerability than maybe some other people might have.
Actually, the morning of 9/11, my experience of it mirrors almost exactly Jesse's. So yeah, it was a huge shock. And in a goth context, I'm not exactly sure how that impacted my local community. I can remember as an individual just just feeling a layer of dread. And of course, seeing the xenophobia and racism rising was just terrible. But I can remember much more vividly being impacted by Columbine for sure. And especially the subset of goths who wore trench coats were obviously really affected by that. So my ex wore a trench coat in high school and carried around a long metal case with him around the school in 1999. So after Columbine, our school principal got nervous and asked him to open the metal case and show him what was inside. And just as a matter of principle, my ex refused until he was forced to, and I think that police were involved by this point.
Yeah.
And when he opened the case, it was filled with Warhammer stuff. Yeah, and he was still expelled for this actually, and pursued legal action against the school, which in the end went nowhere. But yeah, just terrible. And it was a snapshot of the nervousness of the time around people who dressed anything like the perpetrators of the Columbine shootings. And maybe one of the more intense examples of how it could go for you if you're perceived to be in any way associated with the beliefs or aesthetic of the shooters. And from what I remember, the level of suspicion was quite high for people who dressed alternatively for at least a couple years afterward. But especially wearing a trench coat put an automatic target on you for that suspicion. So that was my memories of the experience.
There have been things like, I remember with Haiti, and I imagine with other events like that, where I have seen different clubs and stuff, they'll do a fundraiser night and contribute in that way.
Yeah.
To the point about Columbine, I was one of those guys wearing a long leather trench coat every day when that was happening. That was just, it wasn't even so much like, oh, this jacket is totally my aesthetic. It was just like, oh, this is the best jacket that I have, and it worked for the weather. So, it was kind of my uniform at the time. Thankfully, I was out of high school at that point, and I'm very, very glad for that, because I remember thinking at the time, oh God, this is going to be really bad for anybody like your ex, Lindsay, who is still kind of under the day-to-day supervision of some paranoid school administrator. It is also just it is so morbidly quaint to think about the idea that there was a time when a single school shooting was the topic of conversation for nearly a full year, rather than just, being, grist for the day, as it was. Not to be really cold and callous about this, but, that is really as much of it as I think about now. To be on the really glib kind of combative side, if I'm remembering correctly on an old episode, Danny, our mutual friend Michelle, was sort of talking about the differing reactions from within the community in terms of how to respond to this or whatever. Jesse, you were talking about being concerned that people would think you were a bad person. Being 19 at the time, I was just like, fine, if I get a seat on the bus, that's okay by me. I don't really care. Like I was very much in a plug my headphones in, take care of my stuff, hang out with friends. I was, going to class and whatnot. I was not, again, in a very kind of edgy teenage sort of way, I was very much not concerned with, am I putting other people on edge or whatever, which again is not an attitude I would necessarily hold to now. But at the same time, there's a combination of things there, right? There's consideration for other people, and then there's other people just being flatly ridiculous about this sort of stuff. So, that was that. I do sort of remember feeling that kind of that tension within of sort of, oh, do we want to be more welcoming and accepting and sort of talk about the charity work that, like you're saying, Jesse, like, oh, that we've raised funds for, that we did this fundraiser at the nightclub or whatever. Or is it more just this sort of, no, we don't want to be part of, day-to-day polite society. We want to be exclusionary and take off. And I remember sort of feeling that tension, both personally and within the scene at the time for a year or two. In terms of 9/11, I guess the thing for me was immediately very, while it was still sort of going on, kind of in my head flashing forward to, okay, well, this is going to mean all manner of, increased, just cascading bloodshed, which is going to, dwarf whatever the original body count in 9/11 is. This is going to completely disrupt any sense of a larger global stable future that, again, to bring up Fukuyama, that a bunch of, pie in the sky people might have been thinking of leading towards this. In terms of the scene, I think it was almost more of a kind of a reminder that, and again, to kind of almost tied into the industrial side of things as well, the world is subject to forces and hegemonies and bodies of power that the individual has very little access to, very little agency with. And to be frank, shit's not going to be okay. It's not going to get better. There isn't a general sense of pessimism that I really remember kind of hanging over me for such a long time thereafter, in terms of what the actual future was going to look like. And really, like, not to be, a gloomy Gus or anything, but hey, it's a goth podcast, but a series of, whether that's things like Brexit, whether that's Trump, whether that's inaction on climate and whatnot, just a whole series of these cascading events sort of kind of just squashing out that little kind of window of optimism that the 90s were.
Yeah, climate change wasn't real in the 90s, so we're all good.
There was an ozone layer, and we fixed it. We were there, Danny. Yeah. We wore spin art T-shirts, and I recycled my empties, and we did that.
Yeah, we're good.
Kids. We fixed it.
You guys are making me think of some actual connections potentially that weren't obvious to me, but maybe something to do with 9/11's effect on the community. Maybe that's when the military ended. Because it just meant much at that time.
I'm sorry, when the what ended? I didn't catch it.
The military fashion show.
Oh.
I mean, certainly not the song. The song playing. But, there was definitely a time, in all of those goth industrial bunker type places, that wearing some sort of uniform paraphernalia, if not head to toe, an aspect, was so a standard look to achieve even.
It also kind of, I think, overlaps with what we were talking about before with the whole agrotech sort of moment, which is, for me, often a kind of an inversion of the sometimes too subtle critique of militarism that, your Lieboks and your Front 242s had been doing up until that point. When you then get, to grab a couple of names out of a hat, Grendel and Combi Christ, and I like Grendel and Friends with JD and everything like that. He and I have had this conversation. With this sort of much more open-ended kind of military imagery and sloganeering. Certainly, there are all manner of people who latch onto that as something that, is kind of tied in with the power fantasies that U.S. militarism and the response to 9/11 engenders, and I think that's again, that very critical eye that industrial culture had always lent to that up until that point really got drowned out in a lot of like, well, it's got a beat and you can dance to it, and that was not necessarily for the betterment of that culture. This is maybe as good a time as any to tie it back in with sexism, to shout out mutual friend and former guest of the show, Allison Fraser, and her article, I Will Not Shut Up and Swallow, Combi Christ and Misogyny in the Goth Industrial Subculture, in the Under My Thumb compilation there. So, I think that very aggressive, macho, militaristic response or thread or aesthetic that you started seeing in the culture, I think that in many ways that's a kind of an uncritical or an unreflective mirroring of just the macro, U.S. imperialist culture of the time.
Yeah, I think a big one for me was FGFC 820 around that time, as far as bands are concerned. I guess the one thing that stuck out to me about Columbine, because I mean, obviously, yeah, I had experiences with like getting talked to in trouble with a dean for wearing a trench coat and that kind of thing. But I feel like the sense that I get is that pre-Columbine, there was more of an association, or at least like a sarcastic relationship internally between being goth and being depressed or sad or morose. When I was going back and watching a lot of videos on YouTube from the 90s, there were a lot of people joking about that or even connecting the two in a way. And it was kind of an in-joke, kind of a recognition of the reality of feeling deep sorrow and that kind of thing, kind of kicking against the compulsory societal happiness that a lot of people experienced, and talking about suffering and death and that kind of thing. And then I feel like when Columbine happened, a lot of people went the other direction. You had like Voltaire on the news and goths writing letters to their newspapers about how goth was actually very happy and nonviolent. And I feel like whereas Junja Brill's book was kind of a summation of sexism in the early 2000s, I feel like Gillian Venter's Gothic Charm School, I think, came out in 2008. I don't remember exactly, but I think that was kind of an encapsulation.
98, actually. It was right before. I just looked it up because I was thinking the same thing.
98?
I don't know about the book, but I'm talking about the community itself and her movement.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking of the book.
Started in 98?
Yeah.
The book may have, yeah.
Yeah, because that book to me was more of an encapsulation of the change in tone post-Columbine, whereas in the book she's talking a lot about, be kind to strangers, show them that you're not threatening, deflate that perception of being mean and scary or satanic, that kind of thing. And I feel like a lot of that happened. So maybe we can talk a little about the more cultural aspects, the milieu kind of thing. And I know we brought up elitism earlier on. We could talk about a bit about that. We could talk about what other goths presented to you as being important in terms of lifestyle and behavioral patterns, the kind of trope of goths at Denny's at 2 a.m. drinking coffee, or everyone having read Dracula or that kind of thing. What are your experiences with that?
Definitely had tons of those things. Definitely different diners. Good old Denny's drunk tank was always an option. In LA, still to this day, Cantor's is among spots. Yeah, definitely there was, your posers, your Mallgoths, your tourists, your elite, and then just your good old goth, I guess. When I entered the community, Vampire the Masquerade was definitely a thing. So there were definitely a bunch of cloak-clad people taking your hand, saying, "Good evening, milady." And Julian Venters and the kind of etiquette of 90s mannerisms, not so much as what was just referenced post 9/11, but within the 90s, I was literally told when I was entering the community, okay, when we get into the club, stop smiling. Okay. You want to have your face more stoic.
Mm-hmm.
You want to sit more like composed. And of course, the dancing, we've all seen, the cobwebs and the bats and all of that. They would pull us aside and we'd get demos, not in the club, but in apartments. I remember these older New York goths and older LA goths. They were probably in their mid or late 20s. And they would say, okay, go like this, then go like this. Now that's picking up the penny. And then if you go like this, here's a variation where you can go into catch the bat, pet the bat, and let the bat go, or release the bat.
Sweep the cobwebs.
Yeah, and like some people will talk about you're doing the crystal ball or whatever, or Could also, if you move your hands a little bit different, now you are playing with the bat, or if you do it like this, now you're playing with the cat. I mean, so there were definitely, for myself and my whole experience in this subculture, dancing is among the ultimate, if not the ultimate, expression of the love and the union that you can have with the music. And for myself, going back then compared to now, you know, where the common rhetoric that I see and is, as long as you like the music, as long as some of, and I do agree with that, but for myself, it's like, you kind of have to love it. If you love it, you love it. Don't force it, or give it a chance and see what happens with all that's available then and now. But it was a full blown society back then, and with the elitism of it, I think when you're a newcomer too, you know, there's obviously some people that they are looking like they are the full package. Some of them might have acted like they were the full package, but you know, back then I think it really was a lot more peacocking, and I think that's part of the common thread of our subculture throughout the years, going back to, you know, the Promenade King's Road in London and just strutting down that urban catwalk, peacocking, checking out people, to nowadays, maybe it's your TikTok reel or your whatever. Well, back then, you know, it was the coffee houses, it was the clubs, it was the shows, and you kind of had to bring it all the time, unless you were going to the record shop. But I think maybe some of that, though, too, was that so someone like you could see you, because you couldn't really search online for this whole group of people that you have a ton of stuff in common with. And I was just going to say, I think nowadays, for as much as there is available on the internet, I think that sometimes, at least in my experience, I feel like some of the younger people entering feel like, I've already looked that up. Okay. Happy to share more with you if you'd like. And kind of leave it at that. Because but I think that the problem with that is that so much misinformation is still on the internet. And I think kind of especially about the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah, when I think back to that time, I think the question of what is and isn't goth was a big topic. And I know it still is, and it's talked about a lot. But yeah, so it could have been for music genres, because that's always been something a lot of people wonder about. I think there were a lot of concerns or complaints about being compared to emos, and gatekeeping people who consider themselves emo. Was it okay to gatekeep about people considering themselves emo? Was it not? Like that was definitely a big topic. And I think gatekeeping in general, because I think the community that I was a part of was smaller, there was kind of a more, I think overall, more welcoming atmosphere, because maybe there was a feeling of there's not many of us, so the more the merrier. But like I think both Jesse and Bruce mentioned, there was gatekeeping, because there's the question of, this is kind of our safe space, and so who's okay and safe to let in, who isn't. So that definitely was also talked about a lot. And on the point of smiling, I laugh because I definitely can remember comments. The funny thing that I remember was sometimes watching bands and hearing comments from people being like, oh, they're smiling too much. While I do feel like a lot of us were really kind of bubbly and friendly and smiley ourselves. So it was a little bit of a double standard, but holding artists to maybe a more serious standard than ourselves, I guess. But also, yeah, the dancing too, Jesse, absolutely was like a big part of it, and kind of almost making fun of ourselves for our dance moves and saying, oh, you know, there's there's this classic dance move, and one all ages venue that had a few shows one time, I think it was the Cultural Center, had one wall that was completely a mirror. And so I vividly remember that we were dancing and kind of all facing ourselves in the mirror and watching us doing all of these classic dance moves and laughing and having such a great time at the same time, which is awesome. And lastly, I remember something that was really exciting was annually we'd have a goth picnic, which of course we named Gothnic because we liked doing that apparently in the local park. And so that was always a time for everyone to put on their finery and bring some food and of course take a lot of photos, like, pose for some very dramatic photos. But yeah, that was something that was pretty exciting for us. And actually, there's one more thought I had, which we already touched on, but it was definitely being concerned or complaining a lot about the inability sometimes to find jobs that would allow us to have our, our unique self-expression. So that was definitely a big topic, and just trying to think of either ways to get around it or sharing tips about places that would actually hire if you had visible, like tattoos and piercings, for example.
Yeah.
But definitely, I think with the age range, especially too, of the people who were hanging out, like it was a lot of people just kind of getting out of school and trying to find their first job. So that was a big concern at the time.
And then if you get the job, then now am I a sellout?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Try explain selling out to TikTok kids.
No, I'll sell out every time we sign in.
Yeah, for my part, just very quickly about the emo question. Danny, see, again, much like being out of high school by the time Columbine happened, I was lucky in that when I was getting into the scene, emo was just still like sunny day real estate. It was not something, it was not white belts and swoopy haircuts. It was not on anybody's radar whatsoever, so that wasn't really a question. For me, I think in terms of what, sorts of pressures or codification or formalization was happening, like I alluded to, I kind of already had a lot of the, not a lot, but some of the some of the literary, the artistic, the general art, liberal arts sort of background touchstones very much in place. So I felt comfortable with that. For me, a lot of conversations that I found happening with people were really more about specifically films and music. Like, okay, like give me a list of shit I can check out, because I'm a total sponge for that sort of stuff. And I will absolutely want to go and look those things up. In terms of, fashion, clothing, makeup, and dancing, in a smaller town like Vancouver, compared to LA, certainly we did not have anything as, kind of formalized as those sorts of, somebody giving you formal lessons or anything like that. It was much more of a sort of, well, you pick up on it by observing, and you figure out based on watching what people are doing, what works, what doesn't work for you individually or for the larger space. And you kind of find a way to navigate within that, or you don't, and then if you don't, okay, fine. Maybe you have a bit of a rep or whatever it might be. Certainly, I can remember for the first few months when I was going to Sanctuary, predominantly the club in Vancouver in 98 and 99, I remember sort of almost making this kind of like, visual inventory or portfolio in my head of these people who I never had conversations with, but they had a particular look, they had a particular aesthetic, they danced a certain way or whatever it might be. And you sort of kind of formed, and a lot of it was just pure presumption on your part, and again, you learn a lot just by observing, like the dancing thing. I think one of the big, tale as old as time, right? One of the reasons why gatekeeping even exists is because you do not want people just kind of coming in and dancing up on somebody else, and like we've all seen a million times, right? Protective circles being formed or somebody actually being tapped on the shoulder and told to back off or whatever it is. So, you pick up on a lot of those things by inference. Was elitism a thing? Was gatekeeping a thing? It was, but I think as Lindsay was sort of hinting at there, it was almost always with this kind of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, self-mockery sense of things, right? If somebody sort of said like, oh, you're going to lose 5 goth points for wearing those socks to the club or something like that. Like, is that serious? No, not really. But it is a joke about ourselves that we tell about ourselves in order to understand ourselves, to kind of paraphrase, who is it? Is it Clifford Geertz's sociology paper? Anyway, there's like a lot of that exists, not so much, I don't think, to keep people out or to make sure that people with this fashion sense don't end up sitting at Denny's with you, but that rather that there is a field testing, right, of certain ideas, of certain motifs, of certain attitudes. And we are trying to develop a sense as to what we want this thing to be or what we do or do not like about it. To that end, definitely music kind of became the big, and that was one of the most visually obvious things in terms of people voting with their feet. And in terms of just, no, I am not dancing to this. This is not what I got dressed up and took the bus for 3 hours for in order to hear this song or this type of music or whatever. And I am visibly leaving the dance floor, and people are going to notice that I am not dancing to so-and-so's set tonight. I think.
Well, I want to jump onto that visible thing. I think I may have told this before, but we did have a little bit of a resistance movement in the club in Central Illinois that I was at, where whenever Bob, who was the DJ, would go on too long of a set of like industrial music that people weren't really vibing that much, a group of people would just go into the dance floor, sit down, and start like playing Magic the Gathering in the middle of the floor.
Occupy the club.
Open their Warhammer briefcase.
Right.
But just the last thought that came to mind about this in terms of, people being Uber or whatever it might be, I wouldn't want to name names or anything like that. I think one of the things realizations that I sort of had was that as much as we might, before people or get to know them or whatever it is, you sort of have this picture of this person as, oh my God, they always look so well put together or whatever it might be, or, oh, this person's dancing is so great or things like that. I think the more time that I spent in the scene and then when I actually started DJing within it, I think sort of recognizing that the people who actually do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of putting nights on, organizing, Gothnik that Lindsay is talking about, or running the local, message board or whatever it is, where people congregate, or the people who host, film nights or whatever it is. The people who are kind of the most involved or are doing the heavy lifting, the overlap between that and what is viewed, I think, from the outside, or maybe even from the inside, as being the most uber or the most elite, doesn't really map onto that. There isn't like a one-to-one connection between those things, in terms of community participation and just how absolutely crystal perfect your hair and makeup look every single night. There are certainly some people who do that, who have, the look entirely on point and also are DJs or are doing this or whatever it might be. But sort of recognizing that you did not have to have this absolutely impeccable facade that you'd better not let drop for even an instant in order to be part of the scene, to contribute to it, to work with it, to build it. That was sort of something that I came to maybe about 2 years in. And I kind of that's when I kind of felt a lot more comfortable and a lot more like, okay, I don't, need to worry that somebody's going to see me smiling, or I don't, I'm not going to be afraid that somebody, saw me ordering a drink that isn't entirely thematically appropriate for the night, or God knows whatever other expectations we place upon ourselves.
If it's not absinthe or snake bite and black, you're not a real goth.
Exactly. Yeah.
I guess a couple things that stood out to me were the perception of being more enlightened than the mainstream, being superior to the unwashed masses. Like I heard the term sheeple thrown around a lot, and of a lot of defining ourselves against the other, the abstracted mainstream. And I think, not to say that we don't do that anymore, but it felt like it was a lot more important to be hardline against anything perceived mainstream rather than just ambivalent. sometimes to that cringe level of like the dude who thinks all pop music is vacuous tripe and not real music and that kind of thing. So I think there was a lot of that adversarial relationship between, and maybe like to your point earlier, like it may have probably came out of feeling like there was a trauma from interacting with outsiders, and that kind of animosity or whatever it is, defensiveness developed. And then for as far as like values and things, the people I was talking to, there wasn't as much talk about music. I mean, it was a thing, but the topics that came up most were generally being well read in Gothic literature, like, you know, Varney the Vampire and Poe, or even like the newer stuff like Anne Rice and Poppy Z. Bright. I remember there was a YouTube video I watched that was like a mini documentary on the Chicago goth scene, and somebody even said something to the effect of, if you don't know a lot about Gothic literature, you're not really a goth, something like that. Mm-hmm. So there was a kind of valuing of intellectualism that had a big focus, the kind of pursuit of academic studies or pseudo-academic expertise, and a lot of conversations around philosophy and creating that perception of thinking deeply about the world as being part of goth. And that experience, for better or worse, really kind of influenced the way that I interact with goth and myself, even like to today. And so I thought that was a bit of a difference from now. Whereas, like you were saying, Jesse, it's people talking a lot about, well, you just have to like the music. And even to the point of aestheticizing everything, this kind of lifestyle aspect where you had, your car had to be goth, your house had to be goth, you had to bake a cake in a goth way, right? We had like Gothic Martha Stewart, and Voltaire did that book about how to DIY everything in your life into goth in some way. And I feel like there was a lot more emphasis in the early 2000s on, maybe because there was less goth music coming out, but there was a lot of emphasis on how was the rest of your life, the way that you lived a goth kind of lifestyle.
I guess one thing that I kind of noticed as a change that I didn't enjoy as we moved from the 90s, where I got into the scene, and the 2000s was one of the things that I kind of fell in love with the goth scene for, was the sense that, you know, we were different, we were other, but we weren't necessarily needing to shove that in the faces of everybody. We just kind of wanted to do our own thing. We would go to our own clubs and have fun. And yeah, we'd get harassed or assaulted or things like that on occasion, but we weren't really asking for it so much other than just by existing. Where I felt as it went on, especially I think kind of with the rise of Hot Topic and their t-shirts with all those slogans, those little
chicks,
superiority,
dig, scrawny, pale guys. Yeah.
Yep. All those sort of
normal people scare me.
Exactly.
I'm Skexy and I know it. Sorry, I can do this for days.
I'm sure you can. But I think with the rise of that, it kind of normalized this idea of broadcasting your freak flag in a way, in sort of an edgelord kind of way, where the idea was to get a rise out of people rather than just, you know, I just want to live my life and be, you know, I don't care what you think of me. I'm going to go do my own thing. Leave me alone. I'll leave you alone. It was more, let's kind of be out there. And I think this Hot Topic, the sort of Mallgoth presentation thing too, was that sort of, it was a defense mechanism that came up too. Tired of getting picked on. So maybe if I can scare everybody, I won't be picked on because they won't approach me. And I get that, but I didn't like that when I saw that was happening to the subculture moving into the late 90s, into the early noughties. That's one thing that I kind of felt the scene was moving away from what I really gravitated towards. That, and just what we discussed in recent episodes as well, the sense of humor. I felt in the 90s, there was a lot of that self-referential sense of humor. The whole idea of the goth taxonomies, of the perky goth and the romantic goth, and all of that was an inside joke. It wasn't intended to be
Yeah.
a hard and fast, you need to pick your lane and stay in your lane. I actually viewed it partly as a joke and partly as a, decision for any given goth night. What style do I want to put on today? It's not my style, but do I want to be more bondage influenced today, or do I want to be a little bit brighter color? Do I want to be a little bit more trad? It generally went towards romantic goth in general, but I also like to kind of make fun of the scene in itself as well. One of the things I was known for in my original scene was I would go out in all white just because I wanted to sort of.
There was always somebody at the club like that. Yeah,
there was, and I was the one in the champagne scene. That was my shtick, and I got a real good attention for that. And it was a lot of fun, just kind of sticking it to the idea that it has to be all black. Now let's throw in some all white. Now, it's still all monochrome, and it's still pretty much, it's not like I went in all, like yellow athleisure wear or something like that. That would be harder to play off of, while still staying within the aesthetic. And then another thing, a lot of people were mentioning the smiling thing. I cottoned onto that sort of trope real early on. And when I went to my first convergence, I decided to kind of play with that trope a little bit too. They had a masquerade ball. And so I very purposely got myself a nice comedy mask. And that was
Excellent.
my mask for the masquerade. And what I loved during that night is wandering around the club in my comedy mask, watching the other people react and watching smiles creep in and then just getting shut down. Like, nope, can't smile at that. I want to smile, but I can't smile at that. And watching people force the smile off of their faces. And I thought that was so much fun.
It's so interesting. We all had that experience because I was thinking about that as we've been talking. And I also sort of, by proxy, assimilated that like goths don't smile thing, even up until without really realizing it. I remember at my wedding, my dad was the photographer, and him arguing with me about, you need to smile. And I just had this internal, no, I can't smile. That's not, that's not a thing goths do. Even like, it's very strange. And it's weird that stuck with me. Yeah.
Yeah. I never really gravitated towards that. And my original scene was actually really very fun loving. And there was a lot of smiling and a lot of laughter. So once I broke out of that, going to things like Convergence and seeing the larger subculture all congregate in one place, really made some of those things that I viewed as sort of almost myths, because it wasn't my lived experience, but it was what I read about on like Usenet and IRC and some of those online spaces that I was on. I actually got to see it in real life, and it was interesting, but I just felt it kind of got worse as we moved on to the Noughties, where some of those jokes started being taken seriously.
Yeah.
The slogans on the shirts weren't just kind of silly, goofy things. They were, I want to put myself out there and scare people, or the whole, you have to pick one of those styles. You can't mix and match. You have to be, what kind of goth are you, rather than, oh, let's do a quick fun taxonomy of people in the club tonight. It became, no, which one are you? I have to know, because it will determine whether I can be friends with you or not. And that sort of thing seemed to become more prevalent at that point. And I think we're sort of starting to grow out of that as well, which is good. So yeah, that was kind of my experience tangentially, coming out of one era and seeing bits of the birth of and tail end of that second era and how things changed. Was really interesting, disheartening for a while, but then glad to see it kind of started fading as well.
I remember when they taxonomized the eclectic goth, which is the goth who wears a little bit of everything. And I remember thinking, isn't that just goth? But whatever.
Is anybody here old enough to have had a goth code on alt.gothic?
Yes.
This was, if for those who are not aware, this was actually a whole questionnaire that you filled out, and then it generated a string of data that you would then have to like decode in order to figure out this person's dress style. What was their sexual orientation? Where did they live? Like, it was the ASL thing, but taken to the nth degree. specifically along these sorts of Gothic questions or alignments, and people would post these as their SIGs in alt Gothic and things like that. So if you need to know that, this person does not approve of Valor era Christian death, all of that information is contained within every message that they send to the group.
Yeah, I definitely took the test. I never really bothered posting or adding a SIG, but I love the test, but I love personality tests in general.
Okay, well, so I wanted to also ask about vampires, because at least for me, that was a cultural element of Goth that had kind of a long tail past the 90s. And it was kind of a cultural phenomenon that was around everywhere. So I did you get into vampires? Did you see a lot of vampire ephemera? Were you a vampire? What's your experience with that?
Oh, I fell in love with Bela Lugosi when I was like 4. So when all of that was going on in the 90s, again with Vampire the Masquerade, I didn't actually play, but I was surrounded in it, and I appreciated all of the cloaks, and I definitely love the romantic vampire aesthetic for sure. The Beverly Hills actually had a fan club and another vampire. They have some their own scene in LA area, then and now, and it puts the Gothic in the goth subculture for sure, same as the literature and all of that. And at the end of the day, so many of us really are dark romantics, and we revel in that romanticism in so many different ways. So definitely vampires had a huge effect on me from the mainstream culture as well as within the subculture.
There's a song by The Awakening called Dark Romantics. That was the first goth song I ever heard. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, anything else? Sorry to interrupt.
Back then in the 90s in particular, definitely, even if somebody didn't identify as a vampire, or even if somebody wasn't playing the Vampire the Masquerade, I mean, definitely you saw a lot of bat necklaces. You might have seen some bat eye makeup. Bats were there in the decor of where you were at. Like you were saying, even at home, you would see bats. Around late 90s, early 2000s, I had these double doors going to my master bedroom and flanked by bats at either corner. So definitely had that. Whereas nowadays, obviously, vampire goths and vampires are still out there, and they're also sharing spaces sometimes still. But I feel like big picture overall, you really don't see all these outwardly vamps out and about unless it's their event.
Right. A vampire ball type thing. That's where they all pop up, but not really on your standard goth night.
I was and still am a huge vampire fan. So I think I actually partially was attracted to the goth scene because of Bram Stoker's Dracula. That as beauty and fashion standard, Winona Ryder as Mina was the top for me. I remember having a poster of her in my room. And I was also, I think, simultaneously really extensively reading Anne Rice too at the time. My fashion sense was a lot more like frilly, lacy at that time too. So definitely influenced by that. I named my dog Mina after Mina from Dracula. And actually to this day, most Halloweens I do a vampire costume for myself and her. So definitely runs in the family. Loving vampires.
Runs in your veins.
Yes, exactly. I had a friend in the scene who had filed his incisors into fang shaped. So that was pretty neat. And I never actually played Vampire the Masquerade, which in retrospect, I'm not sure why. I did used to hang out in the bedrooms of friends who would play it, and often just kind of chill out reading or listening to them. And lastly, I have never been to, I don't know if there's multiple or one main one, but the vampire ball always seemed really fun. So maybe I'll still make it someday, but.
For my part, yeah, I was very much into anything, vampire related as a little kid from years before the idea of, goth culture was even something that I would have had any sort of point of contact with. Yeah, again, like I said, I was sort of coming at a lot of this stuff from sort of the literary lit geek sort of background. So having a basis for that, having read a lot of books, and a lot of mythology about that, I was very, very interested in that. Certainly, as we've alluded to, it's they were having a moment in the 90s between the Coppola movie and of course the adaptation of Interview, which I will still throw that on every like 5 or 10 years and just right. And
blew my mind when I saw
God,
it.
yeah, no, I mean, I can't front, as much as we want to say like, oh, it's this, it's cheesy, it's that, or whatever. When I was 13 or 14 and I saw that movie, it was the coolest fucking thing imaginable, So played a fair bit of VTM, drew the line at LARPing. When I found out about LARPing, that was sort of my like, oh, all right, I guess I'm not that sort of a geek, was sort of my like line in the sand there. And then I think that sort of also carried over into coming into an awareness that there were people who did sort of carry this whole sort of persona, or, again, to use the wrestling parlance, gimmick into real life, was something that sort of gave me a little bit of a like, okay, yeah, that's a bit much for me. If you want to do that, that's fine. But that sort of degree of whatever you want to call it, facade, personality, this, that.
Vampiric kayfabe.
There we go. Believe it or not, I did just see Gangrel wrestle a match in Toronto last year. Still had the viscous red liquid in the moment.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So yeah, no, it was a very, very easy on ramp, I think, and it always, it'll wax and wane. I think from generation to generation. But it was very much having that moment in the 90s. There were a whole lot of, reasons for that. I've read various theories as to, coming out of AIDS and this and that and whatnot, as to why it was popular. There's a handful of sociological books about this. I remember a very cheesy, I think 1996 or 1997 TV special called Vampires Thirst for the Truth that I saw when I was, 16.
Yeah.
That like drew the line between vampire mythology and like the modern goth scene. And oh boy, that was catnip to me as a little kid back then. So yeah, never, something, thematically and aesthetically I've always been interested in and probably always will be. But in terms of trying to sort of produce or maintain that sort of image or personality out at the club or whatever, yeah, that was never really my bag. I might have been a little bit scared off when the very first time that I went to Sanctuary, somebody maybe smelling fresh meat immediately went over, gave themselves their hand, and introduced themselves as the Queen. And yeah, that was enough to scare me off into the corner for the rest of the night.
I love that. There were a lot of, I don't know if it's the same one. There's one I watched a few months ago on Amazon Prime that was similar about, psychic vampires and their interaction with the goth scene. But there were a lot of documentaries and videos about that specific thing. And, psychic vampires and sanguine vampires had their own, day in the spotlight along with, Vampire the Masquerade and that kind of thing. And there was a lot of cross-pollination.
Oh, Temple of Set stuff and everything. I remember that being thing online.
That's right.
Sorry, very quick psychic vampires story here. Bunch of friends and I went out and saw Danzig with Doyle on guitar doing a Misfit set about, 10 years ago. And, some of our female presenting friends were invited to go backstage, and they were texting us from backstage saying like, I think we're going to meet Glenn Danzig. What should we ask him? And I said, I need to know if Danzig thinks vampires are real. So please ask Danzig if vampires are real. And so they asked him this, and he sort of kind of like cryptically sort of said like, well, there's like certain forces that can be used in strange ways. And my friend was like, oh, you mean like psychic vampires? And he was like, his face just lit up, like, yes, like he was so excited that somebody knew what psychic vampires are. So there's those, but then actual real vampires are much more like bestial beings who like rip your throat out and just guzzle the blood down. They don't suck blood or anything like that. Those are the real vampires, according to Danzig. So there you go, straight from the horse's mouth.
That was a whole what is and isn't a real vampire was as much of a thing as what is real goth.
True.
I remember I talked to a promoter once when I was getting into DJing who clearly was lying but trying to impress me or something. But she said she went to a 69 Eyes show on the Strip at one point, and she said after the show, Yerky went out with her out to the Strip and held her hand and said, "Watch this," and then she said all the lights down the Strip went off and then back on because he was this like psychic vampire guy. And I was like, what is wrong with you? But yeah, another aspect to that is the interplay between goth and other subcultures, like the vampire subculture. Obviously it's become entangled with different groups throughout the years. Somebody brought up earlier, there was a dynamic between emo and goth, obviously goth and industrial as well. What are your experiences around that? Adversarial, friendly? What was going on in your world?
Never really any problems with industrial that I could tell, but I hear that maybe at least in the LA area, it's been a little bit more factioned in recent years, but I loved it all. It was a good time for me. And the emo, definitely, you didn't want to be attached to that from what I experienced. You just know. And there was not going to be a crossover night. I do see crossover nights now in California.
I'm not surprised. Yeah.
But back then, definitely not. There was a little bit of aesthetic crossover for sure. And it's not like if an obviously emo person or obviously emo dressed person showed up, the gatekeeper would be like, good night. I never saw that. I saw them get inside. But yeah, it was not the group you wanted to be linked with. And ironically enough, though, like some emo bands that rule the scene, of course they're in LA and members may be embraced by the subculture as people, but not necessarily like, we're going to play your song.
Yeah.
And I don't know, with the music back then versus now, I mean, definitely, I'd say back then, as far as the fetish elements that got wrapped in certain places, I feel like it could be compartmentalized. You have the option to go somewhere with that element or to go somewhere without that element. But again, it's like somebody that was clearly coming from that wouldn't probably be excluded by any means. They would have that safe haven as well. And I feel like in a way, at least from my perspective back then, it really added to the ambiance. It was almost like art installations within a night out. Nowadays, I think the werewolves are starting to get in.
We're talking about maybe like a kind of feeling of being against like certain other subcultures like emo or something like that. Again, I'm hoping I'm not looking back on like 20 years ago with rose-colored glasses or anything like that. But from what I recall, again, it was, I think because, again, it was a smaller city, there were less people in various subcultures to begin with. There was more of a trying to focus on similarities rather than focusing too much on differences. So if, for example, especially like a younger person who was maybe dressed in a way that people would consider more emo showed up to Goth Coffee, I don't feel like they would be picked on or told to go away. Rather, there was a focus on trying to be like, okay, well, here's some of the music we're interested in. Do you think you would like that? Here, I can recommend some artists for you. Or this event is coming up. Why don't you come by and check it out and see if you like it? And I mean,
does the Canadian stereotype have anything to do with that?
Maybe, I'm not sure. Yeah, potentially, but yeah. So I think it was definitely more of a kind of excitement if someone else was showing, a new person showed up. So maybe, oh, okay, this is new and fun and exciting. Doesn't happen as often, probably, as in bigger cities. And I could say the same about other subcultures as well. Like I remember, and I'm sure a lot of people remember that there was also the topic of like, is Marilyn Manson considered goth? And there were people who were really into Marilyn Manson, and they would show up because they'd be like, okay, you're showing the kind of visual cues that you would be into Marilyn Manson, and I am too. Right. And so, what are your favorite Manson songs? And for the most part, people would again kind of try to steer them into, okay, but we're also into this kind of music. And sometimes people would be open to, attending events and hearing new music. And sometimes people just wanted to talk about Manson. So they would just fade out, right? And I think it was kind of a self-correcting, I wouldn't say problem, self-correcting situation, I guess, in that way. Yeah, so I hope I'm remembering that accurately. I'm sure there was more snarking and infighting and stuff like that I'm remembering, but overall, that was the vibe.
In terms of the emo stuff, it took me a long time to sort of recognize and accept that for a lot of people, emo stuff or emo bands, namely AFI, but others as well, were kind of their gateway and their on-ramp to this, and that people, whose tastes I respect, who are friends of mine who are just a little bit younger than me or whatever, had the same formative experiences listening to those records that I might have, listening to a Manson record or something like that, and just sort of going, okay, fine, you're here now and everything. I mean, I remember vividly. I was
Nightwish.
Yeah. I mean, I was already vividly. I remember like when the Black Audio record came out, and just sort of thinking like, nah, man, this ain't it. I appreciate the try, but no, it's not a thing. In terms of other crossover, there is a large amount of crossover with fetish stuff and general goth industrial stuff in Vancouver. I'm not sure if that's incidental or if that has to do with a lot of the folks who are booking nights kind of working within both of those things. But to Jesse's point, yeah, I think it as long as people have an understanding as to what does and doesn't play in terms of behavior in nightclubs, that's all good, and that can add some variety to things. I feel like we also have, it's maybe less so over the last few years, maybe as some of them have aged out, but there was a slightly long-running kind of like burner influence or burner crossover. You'd sort of get people, kind of in your semi-post-apocalyptic Mad Max tribal-y sort of outfits or whatever, just kind of coming out, who enjoyed the vibes and enjoyed the music. And, generally that was all good. There wasn't a lot of conflict there. Occasionally as a DJ, you'll get people who don't really seem to understand the musical parameters that a night is working within, and they've maybe arrived with it thinking that it's going to be one thing and it isn't. And like you said, like I want to hear some Opeth or Nightwish, or I want to hear some psytrance, or if they're a burner, or if the odd time when we've had a couple of juggalos come out to the night and they want to hear some of that stuff. Like generally very friendly, well-behaved people and everything, but you just have to sort of say, not really on the format for what we play here. And I find that that's generally pretty well received. I don't think that there's been nearly as much sort of tension or conflict, even as there might have been, like I said, kind of around the turn of the millennium, with in terms of, are we a goth club? Are we an industrial club? And is future pop, industrial or goth music at all? And isn't this just happy trance music? And what the hell are we even doing here? That's as much of a time when I can remember there being, or, to Trey's point about kind of people like sitting in and protesting, so-and-so's set. That's really really it. Maybe that has to do with just, the nights that I go to or the nights that I help run, in that, we/my friends and I have curatorial control over what gets played and what doesn't. I'm sure there are all sorts of other nights happening, and maybe even a couple in Vancouver, where, to my mind, a much more hybridization, for good or for bad, is happening there. But I couldn't really speak to that.
Yeah, as a patron, I appreciate that curation. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there are some AFI songs I certainly enjoy, and My Chemical Romance songs that I certainly enjoy. And like you were saying, Bruce, it's an on-ramp into maybe they fall in love with this too. There's tons of genres of music that I do love.
Yeah. Weirdly, a lot of people around me did love that Black Audio album when it came out. So there's that.
I just could not fuck with it. You could hear all the work that had gone into it. It sounded so much more slick and professional than many records of that same ilk, but just couldn't find any bangers in it.
Yeah. For me, being in the Midwest and in the later 2000s, experimenting with emo, I did have a lot of experience with the goth emo thing. Different note, I do remember there being a lot of animosity between metalheads and goths, because I think there was a lot of machismo associated with metal. And so they almost felt like the jocks of the dark subculture, because they'd still pick on you or beat you up for being too soft or femme. But when emo started growing into a better known subculture on internet forums and things, they really got shit on by everyone, especially goths and metalheads. And I think a lot of the animosity came out of stereotypes, specifically around self-harm and the glorification of suicide. There was definitely a group within emo that made that, the self-harm thing, part of their personality. And I know I heard emo songs about wanting to kill yourself after a breakup and going into a lot of detail about that kind of thing. But I think most emo kids weren't interested in that. The problem happened, I think, the beef came about because goths started being called emo when they were getting mainstream exposure. Because, of course, nobody can tell the difference if you're both wearing black or have black nail polish. And because of the emo association with the glorification of self-harm, or the stereotype of that, and the stereotype of being depressed all the time, while goth was trying to move away from that stereotype, especially after Columbine, that sudden association with depression and self-harm made a lot of people angry. And also, there was a lot of people felt like the emo music was juvenile and whiny, shitty music. So I heard a lot of complaints. It's kind of similar to the more recent conflict I saw a lot of people talking about with goths distancing themselves from e-girls in 2018, 2019, because of that same association of this is a completely different thing. It has these negative stereotypes about being a sexual thing or whatever. And because we have these sartorial similarities, people are confusing goths with that same kind of thing. But then, to your earlier point about them having goth emo nights, I do think a lot of that, now that we're out of that era and the new kids are looking at it from a nostalgic perspective, I think a lot of that negative perception around emos being, doing self-harm and that kind of thing has mostly disappeared. And so there's not really as much of and I think now also just subcultures in general share a lot more aesthetic signifiers and mix that kind of stuff up a lot more. Whereas at least when I was a kid, it was less common, I feel like. But
it's also been a generational aging up as well, right?
Yeah.
The throwback emo club night format, which I don't know if it's taken off in Chicago as well, but you basically just play kind of those emo hits from 15 or 20 years ago or whatever, and people just kind of stand on the dance floor and kind of wail along with them and whatever it is. Like that club format is a license to print money right now in many cities across North America.
That's what selling out is. Man, okay, well, this is a weird place to end. Yeah, so before we do that, let's go around, tell us where people can find you online and what projects you'd like them to check out, that kind of thing. So Jesse, if you want to share first.
I am on here, Instagram and TikTok at Jesse Meowser. I don't post much on YouTube at all. I always tell myself I'm going to do it more. Try to post more in general, but yeah, thank you.
I'm online on Instagram mostly at Ultramarine Dream, which is mostly street art, but I do some bats and skulls sometimes, so it's not fully goth art. But anyway, if anyone's interested, I'm also always happy to hear from people who are visiting Berlin, which is where I live. So feel free to send me a message on there if you're swinging by Berlin, and I can let you know what events are happening or even meet up and go together. And there is one Facebook group. I actually don't know who runs it, and I'm not affiliated with it, but you can find it at facebook.com/Gothic Events Berlin. And they do an amazing job of just adding all of the goth and related events that are happening. So I can always recommend that for anyone who's swinging by. And thanks for having me. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
I would also like to shout out Lindsay's street art and the paste ups. They're lovely. They're wonderful. When I get to walk past the ones that she's put up here in Vancouver, it's very nice because I miss her. For my part, I am one half of idieudie.com, which is a website, a zine, call it what you will, which writes about and reviews goth, industrial, darkwave, EBM, and related genres of music. We like to say that we consider darker alternatives. That is also the home of the We Have a Technical podcast, which I run with my IDIUDI partner, Alex Kennedy. We recently just hit our 500th episode, and as a big kind of special event for that, we just released a 3-hour interview with Eskil and Joachim from Covenant. So getting back into, the whole question of, hey, future pop, what is it? Does it belong in the industrial club or not? We tackled that headlong as part of this 3-hour interview. So that's all up at idieudie.com, IDIE_YOUDIE on Twitter, idieudie.com, spelling out DOTCOM on Instagram. And again, the podcast is We Have a Technical on all of your usual podcast apps.
Yeah, and I know Trey and I both really enjoyed your recent Goth comp episode, which I'm now forgetting
that's what I should be shouting out here.
Was.
Not even the Covenant thing is the commentary podcast that we did about the Mick Mercer Gothic Rock.
Yes, that one.
Yes,
yeah.
No,
that was great because that was one of my gateways into early goth. Yeah. I would just be collecting those comps from the record stores as way to discover things, so they were great.
Thanks. Yeah, we had a lot of fun with that one. It was really great to not just look musically back, but also sort of at the person I was, or the person that Alex was, when we were getting those comps, and they were viewed, like you said, as just such a lifeline and such a gateway, opening up to so many different variations and forms of goth stuff. So yeah, those will be pretty easy to find on the We Have a Technical feed as well. They're pretty recent.
Yeah. And this was a really personally satisfying episode for me, and without being hyperbolic at all, I genuinely think we could probably carry on for another 2 hours. So I really appreciate everybody's time and their insight and their stories. So thank you all so much for hanging out with us.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you for
thank you all
of you.
Well, I guess before we do add any post-show musings, as this segment has been so named, I guess there's a couple things. I mean, we could really go on forever with this, but there were a couple subjects I wanted to touch on. The first one is just a little bit about fashion. We did talk about fashion.
Yep.
I just wanted to add a couple thoughts and experiences that I had. For the listener, this is the day after we've recorded, so there's a bit of a time gap here, but I was watching the new video from Random Goth Couple,
Okay.
Before we started, and it was about cybergoth. And that didn't come up at all, weirdly, I don't think, as far as I remember.
No, didn't.
And yeah, I don't have too much to say other than just to mention that it was a thing. That kind of went along with the genres of electro, agrotech, terror EBM, that kind of thing. And there were definitely those people in the goth clubs and just around in general. And so I never really got involved with that. I did at one point try to buy Cyberlocks for Sarah, but the person I bought it from essentially took my money and then shut down the shop, and I never got them. So that didn't work out. But one of the common themes that I picked up on and heard repeated when I was watching through a bunch of videos from the 90s, and I'll have a couple links in the show notes for playlists of videos about 90s goth. But a lot of people mentioned, and Jesse actually mentioned this earlier, that the primary purpose of the fashion was to stand out and be noticed by other goths. And at the time, there really weren't other subcultures that looked like goths. So you really stood out wherever you went.
Yeah.
And that's served as a way to find other people like you, because you couldn't just look them up online. Or if you didn't have a club to go to, or you weren't old enough, that was kind of your primary way of meeting people. And that does make sense to me, because I don't know, maybe 10 years into the 2000s, somewhere in there, 2015 maybe, was when the complaining about not being able to tell who's goth anymore because the normies are dressed like us really started to ramp up. And the anger around that makes sense in the context of coming out of the 2000s and the 90s, where the primary function of the fashion was being undermined. And so for me, it was more an expression and an artistic thing. But for a lot of people, it was a social thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us have come to terms with this now, that there are alternative kids and people who incorporate goth aesthetic into their fashion. But I thought that was interesting. Just to go through some of the elements of fashion at the time as I picked up on it, to sort of paint a bit of a picture. I think Bruce mentioned the PVC pants. Those were the pants that you had to peel off at the end of the night because they were suctioned onto your skin.
Yep.
Trip pants, obviously, that was kind of the Mallgoth thing. We might talk about that a little bit. Lots of crushed velvet and lace and frills. There was the romantic-goth fashion that was really popular, this kind of pseudo-Victorian, neo-Victorian style. A lot of mismatched brocade.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of lip service. Lip service was really big in the 90s, and I think that carried on. And lots of corsets as well. I don't see corsets as much in the clubs. And that was like almost everybody had a corset, like as far as I remember. There were a lot of striped leggings. I think the makeup was generally less extreme than it is now. There were, I think, a lot of people that just had very simple or no makeup, whereas now a lot of the, especially younger crowd, have very extreme, very expressive makeup.
Mm.
There were those gaudy finger armor things that covered your finger and then ended in a point that looked like a claw. A lot of people wore those. That was kind of a Mallgoth thing, but I did see a lot of those around. And then this was interesting that it came up in the chat we were having with some friends, but gas masks were everywhere. They were mostly with cybergoth, but I saw a lot of other goths wearing them as well. And you would take like either a painter's mask of some kind or an actual gas mask, and either you or you would buy from someone who modified it, but like spikes and studs and painted it black and made it look goth. A lot of people had those, and I don't think I realized how widespread it was, because I had 3 or 4 of them. But my first exposure was at a music festival where there was a lot of dust. So most people would have masks, like even the kind of cloth masks that we are wearing, pandemic.
Yeah, right.
For me, it started as like a function of that because there was a goth tent there and somebody would make PVC dust masks. So it had a couple layers and then PVC over the front, and it would hook over your ears. And then they also made the more elaborate gas masks. And so, yeah, I never really connected it in my head that that was a thing happening already because I was kind of in my own bubble. So I didn't realize they were pulling that from the general zeitgeist. But I think a lot of people had those. And a lot of people had contact lenses.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the white, mostly white eye with the dot in the middle, but also just all kinds of colored contact lenses. And that's something I also never see anymore now. And I really kind of miss that because I really liked those. I had a whole bunch of them myself. And I remember the first time I saw somebody with them in. One of the first times I went out to Nocturna, and this guy was sitting on the ground and looked up at me and had these, whited out eyes. And it was this very, like, it sent chills up my spine because it was very like vampiric, and I loved that. Nobody really wears those anymore. As he mentioned that it's probably because the FDA requires they be prescription. Whereas back then you could just buy online colored contact lenses, or usually not the scleras, the full eye thing, but normal contacts.
Yeah.
And I guess you can't really do that anymore without a prescription for it.
Could also be a little bit of a pushback from sort of a Mansonite look, because they were also very popular with Mansonites, and Manson was well known for almost always having some sort of a funky eye change happening with his aesthetic.
And yeah, so like for me, when I look back at the 2000s and the late 90s, people just don't dress like that anymore. I kind of miss it, I think, from a nostalgic perspective, but it really was distinctive. It really was its own. I was talking to Azzy about this. They theorized that now, because we're able to see what everyone looks like all the time online, that's kind of blunted the drive to take chances and do weird things because we're so worried about ending up on a forum somewhere being made fun of. So you don't see the people that look like they're an extra from the Blade Blood Rave or Lestat leaving a kink club kind of thing, or like Nick Fiend as well. The weird alien, sometimes awkward kind of, like the guy who put too many crucifixes in eyeliner on their face, or the person who did the crow makeup. Yeah, it just feels like it's just different, which isn't bad, but I do kind of miss that era of fashion.
Yeah, it's interesting how as you're discussing those fashion styles, how those were part of an evolution of style as well. Because I know you were talking about both a 90s and a noughties thing.
Yeah.
But I'm hearing you talk about things from when you first started getting in, which was towards the end of the 90s, early noughties, compared to what I was seeing when I was first getting in. And there was a lot of overlap there. I mean, obviously the PVC pants, lip service stuff, those were also huge in the early mid 90s, and they stayed good. So were corsets, so were some of the makeup style stuff, but not as much so. But yeah, they definitely had somewhat more elaborate makeup back then. But then there's some stuff that is just completely foreign to me because I wasn't really involved in the noughties. Things like the trip pants and the Janko style stuff, which I was familiar with that style because when I was first in goth, that was something that I saw like skaters wearing. It was really a skate style.
Sure. Yeah, like the Genko.
Right. Yeah. Right. The big old tube pants was a skate style. So it was really interesting.
Yeah. You know what? I also had friends like that, people that listen to Sublime and like that, the stoners, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was interesting when I came back in and started hearing you and others talking about this era and growing up and having trip pants and whatnot, I'm like, oh, really? That's not something I associate with goth at all. So it's interesting how that evolved. I'm kind of curious how much of that was sort of a Hot Topic thing too, since Hot Topic was
Almost
kind of
all
an
of it.
amalgamation. At least when it first opened, it did really cater closer to the goths thing. It would have actual, ball gowns and corsets and lacy frilly things, along with some sort of punk rave skate punky type things, and it would sort of cater to both crowds. And it did seem to evolve through the Noughties away from goth and really double down on the whole skate punk side of things. And it's interesting how that kind of went through with the goth scene, because it was very jarring for me when I went back to a Hot Topic many years after being in one. I'm like, this has nothing goth at all, and then finding out that some of this stuff that I look in there and think this isn't goth at all was something that was part of an era of goth that I missed. So it wasn't quite as much of a departure as I thought it was, which was really interesting to me. The colored eye lenses were also another thing that was not hugely common in the early to mid 90s, but was common enough. And I definitely saw it, but I did see it, like I mentioned before, associated more with the spooky kids and the Manson subculture. Really did that a lot more, but it wasn't uncommon to see up at goth clubs in the sort of latter half of the 90s.
Yeah, I went to a Hot Topic a month or two ago, and I did buy a couple things. Really the only goth stuff I saw was there were a few, they had some trip pants, which was, I think, not surprising. We'll kind of get to I want to talk about Mallgoths in a second, so it makes sense that they were there. But they had, like, I got a skirt that it was basically a knockoff lip service skirt because it had the kind of cross design on it.
Okay.
The only t-shirt that was within the realm of goth there was a Cure t-shirt, but otherwise there wasn't a single goth band, that's a huge shift.
Yeah.
One of the transitions that I think I noticed from the 90s to the 2000s was that in my mind, the 90s were more of like a theater kid in a Dracula novel vibe. And in the 2000s, there was a shift towards futurism. I think that kind of ties in with the cyber goth stuff and the agrotech thing. But I did notice a lot of industrial fashion, both from industrial fans, but also some of the goth fashion had sort of the way they were cut and designed was more like, cyber industrial future kind of thing. And so there was a lot of that, and that seemed to be different than what came before.
Yeah, there wasn't really a lot of future looking stuff in either the goth or industrial aesthetic. Because the classic rivet head style was pretty much the main industrial. It was either rivet head or very, very, hey, look, I've got a band t-shirt and some black jeans.
Yeah.
From the rivet head side of things. It wasn't quite as elaborate as it evolved into, but definitely had, basic spike collars, maybe some fingerless gloves. And mostly big old stompy boots.
Lots of stompy boots.
Was the main style that I was seeing within the industrial, and to a lesser degree, well, not the lesser degree, the different kind of stompy boot you'd see on the goth side of things. Goth side would be more the platformy style stompy boots, where the rivet head would be close to the motorcycle style. Mad Max, which I guess is future, but is kind of a backwards looking future in my mind. That sort of post-apocalypse has always been popular, but not quite so future directed as it became, especially as it evolved to the cyber goth and all those cyberpunk style aesthetics that became popular in the noughties.
And everybody knows what the cybergoths look like. I don't need to describe that. The largest boots I ever saw, it was at Nocturna. I don't remember what year this was, probably into the mid 2000s. But they had to have been custom because they were 2.5 feet.
Mm-hmm.
Like this guy was on stilts basically. It
Right.
was ridiculous, and the soles had holes drilled through them as well. There was like 2 or 3 holes, so you could see through the boot. It was insane. I've never seen anybody before or after wear boots that big, but I think you win the goth night if you have the biggest boots or the pointiest shoes, I guess. And then I guess the other thing I wanted to just chat just a little bit about is Mallgoth, which you brought up.
Yep.
I will say, first of all, because I was thinking about this, we did an episode titled Gatekeeping Mallgoths. And if you haven't heard it, I would recommend checking it out. There's 2 different sections in there, 2 chunks where we discuss Mallgoth. One's kind of in the middle, and then there's one at the end that really, I think, paints a good picture of the mentality and the circumstances that Mallgoth came out of. So I won't repeat myself there. But what's interesting to me is the Mallgoth resurgence that's happening right now. And I don't know if it's dying down now. It seems to me like it's dying down. Like it was kind of around for a year or so. People are just kind of picking and pulling things out of the past and aren't really settling on anything. But it does still happen. I do still see it. It seems to me like that is a group of people almost trying to make a new subculture as a throwback to Mallgoth. At least that's what it feels like to me. When I was a Mallgoth, in my mind, I was goth, or I was trying to be goth. And the Mallgoths I knew felt the same way. You know, kind of going back to the difficulty of finding information. Having, you know, Jesse said there were even people that would kind of take you under their wing, right? If you were lucky, you'd have an elder goth, a fairy goth mother, something like that, who would like, here's some albums, here's this, here's how you do that. But not everybody had that. And so a lot of us had encountered goth in some way. And then we spent a lot of time at the mall because that was the thing you did as a teenager. You went to the mall, you hung out, you goofed around. So you had this store with what seemed like a goth aesthetic and goth music. And so kind of a bit out of ignorance because of limited internet access and that kind of thing, that style arose, obviously also because Trip in New York was making that brand of clothing. But in my mind, I was ostensibly buying goth clothes. And everybody had access to a Hot Topic. Most everybody had access to a Hot Topic. And the Hot Topics all had this similar things. And so it kind of rose out of that. Now I did start picking up like Gothic Beauty magazine. Sometimes at Hot Topic, sometimes at like Barnes and Noble even. But, you know, so from there, I did start to like pick up different styles and get exposed to different types of goth, different types of goth fashion. And so then it evolved from there. Some people have had the idea of like, well, these were just kids who listened to nu metal and they were kind of their own thing. They were kind of a part of a different group. But at least in my experience, we weren't. We thought we were goth. We were trying to be part of that. That was the trope at the time. It's kids who wanted to be goth, didn't know what goth was, ended up in a different social situation. And so then when I started meeting goths, I did get a lot of kind of looking down your nose looks and some verbal sort of comments about being a baby bat or a little bit pejorative, kind of poking fun at what I was wearing. But, you know, that the thing was you had to know a goth, or you had to know where a goth club was, or you're just piecing little bits of information together. I actually didn't even know there was a goth club in Chicago, Neo specifically, until somebody in the McDonald's drive-thru that I was working at came through and said, "Oh, hey, do you go to Neo?" I said, what is Neo? And they said, oh, it's this goth club in Chicago. You look like you would enjoy it. So I had no idea that was even there.
Yeah.
But, you know, there were a lot of new metal shirts and like worn out Converse because we couldn't buy Demonias, you know, because you're just a kid. You don't have money for that. I did pick up some good albums, though. I did discover some good music through Hot Topic. I know you talked about, what was that CD store?
Well, there's Tower Records I mentioned.
Tower Records.
I also mentioned Borders, which is more of a bookstore, but also had very good listening stations.
Mm-hmm. In my experience going to Tower Records, all I kind of ran into was the Goth box.
Mm-hmm. But I got that at Best Buy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Sure. I do have a couple of additional thoughts on the whole Mallgoth, especially the Hot Topic aspect of it. When Hot Topic first appeared, I kind of feel like it was one of the first signals of the sort of move that we've lamented about for ages in the 2010s. But this rise of this fast fashion goth in a box, buy your costume at one shop and go, and everybody kind of looks the same because it all comes from sort of one, mass marketed brand that, is a one-stop shop. It's no longer a bunch of little independent stores in your local city that carry, individual brands like your lip service and things, but it's a single store. It sells a specific aesthetic, and you could just go there and you could buy an entire outfit.
Mm-hmm.
That looks really great in the abstract, but unfortunately, because it's a large mass market store and there are franchises in every mall across the country, that same outfit that looks really cool in the abstract is something that, dozens of people around the country all have the exact same thing or very close to it.
That is a great point. If I can interrupt, otherwise, if you want to keep talking, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's just in one of those videos I watched of goths in the 90s, somebody mentioned, not Hot Topic specifically, but mentioned they were asked about fashion, and they were like, yeah, you have these goths who buy their clothes from a company, and then you show up to an event and 10 other people are wearing the same shirt. And he's like, I don't do that. I go to thrift stores, I DIY, I make my own stuff, and I want to express myself, not look like everyone else that's at the club. So that, I think that was definitely an understandable frustration, especially considering how goths like to be unique snowflakes.
Yeah. No, but this whole the rise of Hot Topic in the the scene that I was involved in the 90s became a bit of a tension point. There was some factionalism happening within the local scene, because one of the long-term members of the scene, actually, she owned a clothing shop just in downtown Champaign, that sold plenty of goth stuff, had a lot of sort of a horror fandom thing. Also did a lot of business. Actually, she probably did the majority of her business with the local strip clubs, and getting them outfits as well. But that was the sort of local independent shop that would sell your lip service and that type of thing. And I did a lot of shopping there and loved getting clothing there. And I hung out there, and I would, I'd volunteer every once in a while and, mind the till for a few hours and that sort of thing at the shop. And it was kind of cool. And then a Hot Topic opened up, and that was direct competition with this place. So there are some people who are members of the scene who would work at the Hot Topic and would defend the Hot Topic aesthetic. And there are some people who were stalwarts of Licks, which is the name of the store. That was the local store. And so there was definitely a real big rift there to some degree that happened within our scene. Very two separate camps that were kind of at odds with each other. Though I was friends with people in both sides. So I kind of saw it from both sides, and I didn't have a problem with people who went to Licks versus who went to Hot Topic. Though my preference was to some degree towards Licks, because I was always more of a person who would prefer the smaller, more independent things. But I did go to Hot Topic. I enjoyed Hot Topic. I got plenty of, little accessories. I don't think I got any major clothing items from Hot Topic, but I definitely got a handful of bangles and accessories and necklaces and stuff like that from them. So they were good for random accessories that were harder to find elsewhere. And they were also just, hey, I'm looking for something random. Let's just run to the mall and check out Hot Topic, because I knew at the time, at least, it at least had some interesting stuff. Even if I didn't always buy it there. But yeah, it was definitely the same sort of debates that we have. Well, less so now, but that we were having like 10 years ago, 5-10 years ago, around the unboxing haul culture, and complaining about people who do that was the exact same complaints we were making in the late 90s about Hot Topic versus your local shop.
That actually reminds me a bit of the division between people who own costume shops and their sort of animosity or frustration towards companies like Spirit Halloween that everybody gets excited about, but they just kind of come into town for a few months, take all their business during the largest costume buying time of the year, and then fuck off. So yeah. I do get the frustration. And weirdly too, when I visited Ohio, maybe not weirdly, but just in a coincidence sense, when I visited Ohio maybe 7 years ago, we visited some friends and we went to they had a local alternative store where you could get, like Alchemy Gothic and Lip Service and stuff like that. They also, because we ended up hanging out with the owner for a while, and he actually gave me this little ornate key that he said Alchemy Gothic had sent him. And he said they were kind of rare or unique. And so I still have it. It's really beautiful, but that was a nice memory. But he also said that a lot of their customers were from the strip clubs, the people who worked there, and they would come in and get their shoes and their outfits and that. And actually, someone came in while we were there and went over and like talked to somebody about stuff. So yeah, interesting crossover, sort of in the realm of how you had the goth industrial scene because you couldn't survive with just goth music.
Yeah, you definitely had to be catering to other groups to make ends meet.
So with that, I think we can wrap up. I thought it would be fun at the end of the episode to play a song from the era, and it's kind of impossible to pick a single song unless it was Dead Stars maybe, but I decided I'm going to play Kathy's song by Apoptygma Berserk and play the VNV Nation remix.
Yeah, that was pretty popular.
That was pretty popular. It's two of the biggest future pop bands at the time together. So I thought it was, and it's a bit melancholy, so it kind of fits in with the goth thing.
I don't know if the goth folks that you were hanging around with at the time ever made fun of the Apoptygma Berserk name, but it was oftentimes in our scene always referred to as Apoptigger Dessert.
No, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, that was the common
that's funny
way that people called it in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was still at the tail end of my club going time at that era.
The only thing that comes to mind is the kind of division between agrotech and other people, because I talked to this guy about the concerts he went to, and he's like, yeah, I saw VNV, and they're just kind of soft. They're kind of, I don't know. And then but I saw Combi Christ, and that's a real fucking band. Like I love, so there's kind of like agrotech dude bros having this weird distinction between not liking the lighter electronic music. But I guess maybe that goes back to our sexism episode where that was considered more of a feminine trait.
To a degree, it also goes back to the rise of EBM in the early to mid, well, I guess more the mid 80s as well. There was a lot of, when I was, to call back to our debate episode where I was debating Andy about that.
Yeah.
Part of what I was researching was the rise of EBM in the history, and I saw a couple of interviews around that where some of the EBM bands were talking about how effeminate, especially with the mix of goth and industrial were at the time. But your Skinny Puppies and Cabaret Voltaires and stuff like that, they felt were kind of effeminate. So they wanted to do something a little bit more masculine. That's why the early EBM had a lot of stuff about working out and getting jacked and things like that, and get your body burned and sort of thing.
There were some like more of the classic EBM songs too had stuff about like muscle cars and things like that in there.
Yeah, so there was definitely something to be said about EBM being a backlash against the sort of effeminization of the musical styles, and they wanted to get back to something which addressed masculinity more. But there's also around the future pop. I don't know if this was mentioned. I haven't listened to the We Have a Technical Covenant thing yet, but I know right around that era when VNV and Covenant was kind of this big dueling, butting heads, two mammoth bands of that scene. Don't remember the band that did it, but there was a parody video that was still out on YouTube, but the Afraid of Swords video, which was sort of a cartoon parody of VNV Nation's style. And they mention as sort of a denigration Eskil from Covenant as, we are not Eskil, he is bad because he is Swedish. And it was just, it's a very funny parody video, but it really emphasizes this sort of idea that was kind of tropey around a lot of VNV songs, which is about battlefields and being with a sword and all this stuff about the sort of masculine, warlike part of a lot of their lyrical themes, even if it's about love or the quote unquote soft stuff that the agritech people were railing against. It was soft stuff with this trope of masculinity in glorification of sort of a warrior aesthetic.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I don't know that one. I did see a lot of parody videos. What comes to mind is I can't remember the name of it, but there was a 2 or 3 episode joke video kind of poking fun at industrial that was some kind of quest for something, an album or something. But there seemed to be a lot of people making comedy stuff back then. All right. Well, this is long enough. So let's wrap up with Kathy's song. I may have to cut this out of the YouTube version. I don't know if I'm going to get copyright striked or whatever. So that may not be there for you, but thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you.
If you would like to support the show, you can head over to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions and take a look at the rewards there. You can join for just $1 and you'll get access to the Discord, and it will help support what we're doing here. But if not, I just appreciate your presence and the fact that you stuck through this whole thing and enjoyed it, hopefully. So thank you for listening, and until next time, stay dark.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was good. And God created man. And man created machine. And machine created music. And machine saw everything it had made, and said, "Behold." everything it had made, and said, "Behold."
Next to me, no why let me come why next to me, no why let me come why next to me, no why let me please come why next to me, no why let me come why next to me, no why let me come why next to me, no why let me come why next to me, no why let me come why next to me, no why let me come why next to me, no why let me
And on the seventh day, machine pressed stop.
The preceding program is a member of the Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.